Thank you for joining us today and listening to this audiobook. We truly appreciate your time and support. Before we dive into the story, I'd like to invite you to do something that means the world to us. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By doing so, you're not just staying connected, you're becoming part of an exclusive community dedicated to celebrating knowledge, culture, and empowerment. If you're interested in the ebook or paperback edition of this audiobook, head over to our Amazon page. You'll find the link in the description below. And for those of you looking to show your support in other ways, we've got custom t-shirts, hoodies, and beautiful African wall art available. Just click the merchandise link in the description to check it out. Once again, thank you for being here with us. Your engagement means everything. It helps us continue creating meaningful content and building a space where we can all grow together. So please take a moment now to like, comment, and subscribe. It's more than just a click. It's your way of saying you're with us on this journey. Thank you and enjoy the audiobook.
Dr. Gavin Harrell presents a never-ending Black history series, People, Places, and Things. The Dark Legacy of Southern Black Codes, Young Reader Edition, How Post-Civil War Laws Were Engineered to Suppress African American Freedom. Book 2. Introduction. So, on April 12, 1861, the Union, that's the North, and the Confederacy, the South, kicked off a massive brawl that turned into the most epic and devastating war in American history, the Civil War. This wasn't just a quick fight, it was a 4-year-long hardcore battle that finally wrapped up on May 9, 1865, with the North coming out on top. Now, this war wasn't just about who had the better army. It was about some really big opposing ideas. At the end of it all, more than 4 million enslaved Africans were finally freed from the brutal chains of slavery. Some of these newly freed folks were super excited to finally get their freedom, but others were pretty freaked out about what the future held. After all, freedom came with a whole bunch of challenges they'd never faced before. For the Southern plantation owners, losing their slaves wasn't just losing workers. It felt like their entire world was flipped upside down. They were not happy, and this anger would stick around for generations, making things pretty tough for the freedmen. So, after the war, everyone was scratching their heads, asking, what do we do with all these freed slaves now? The Republicans, led by President Abraham Lincoln, that tall dude in the hat, wanted to bring the freedmen into society as full citizens with all the rights that came with it. But the Democrats weren't so keen on that idea. They were all about keeping things as close to the old ways as possible, which basically meant making life hard for the freedmen. Lincoln and the federal government stepped in with the Freedmen's Bureau. This agency was all about helping the freed slaves get back on their feet. They worked to reunite families split up by the war and taught freedmen how to read and write, something they really wanted to learn. But the South wasn't going to just let that happen without a fight. Southern lawmakers came up with the Black Codes, a bunch of rules that were designed to keep the freedmen down, limit their freedom, and trap them in unfair work contracts that weren't much better than slavery. So, there you have it, the Civil War ended. But the battle for freedom and equality was far from over, and the freedmen had a tough road ahead of them. So, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help out the newly freed slaves. Sounds good, right? But hold on to your donuts because things didn't exactly go as planned. Instead of just protecting and supporting the freedmen, the Bureau ended up acting like a job agency that pushed many freedmen right back into working on the same plantations they just got freed from. Yep, you heard that right. The Bureau was supposed to be the good guy, but it ended up overseeing labor contracts between freedmen and their old masters, leaving them with no choice but to take jobs that felt way too much like slavery all over again. Meanwhile, in cities across the South, white folks weren't about to let the freedmen rise up economically. They got together and came up with ways to keep wages low and made it so that freedmen had to get these certificates of employment from, guess who, their old slave owners. Talk about stacking the deck against them. Now, fast forward to 1877 and we get to the end of Reconstruction, which was supposed to be the period where the South got rebuilt and African Americans started to gain their rights. But nope. Instead, we got the Compromise of 1877. This deal pulled federal troops out of the South, and without them, things took a serious nosedive for African Americans. The Black Codes, which were already causing trouble, quickly morphed into a full-on system designed to keep African Americans down, pretty much making them slaves again, but this time legally. The American Freedmen's Aid Union had this big, noble goal: to help freedmen rise from the shadows of slavery to become full citizens with all the rights and respect that comes with it. But the black codes were like the ultimate roadblock, twisting the law to keep African Americans trapped in a system that was supposed to be over. So instead of freedom ringing across the land, it was more like freedom was put on hold and the struggle was far from over. So back in the day, after the Civil War ended, there were these super unfair laws called the Black Codes that popped up all over the South. These laws were like the ultimate bad guy in a movie, totally rigged against African Americans who had just gotten their freedom. One of the worst parts of these Black Codes were the vagrancy laws. Imagine this: if you were a black man and didn't have a job, you could get arrested just for that. And then, to make things worse, they'd force you into doing all the tough, dirty jobs that nobody else wanted to do. Not cool, right? But it didn't stop there. These laws required black men to carry around proof that they had a job. If they couldn't show that, bam, they'd get arrested and put to work in hard labor, like some kind of twisted punishment for not being employed. And then there were the pig laws and something called the convict leasing system. These were just more ways to keep black people down, using the law to force them into work that kept them stuck in a bad situation. And then there's sharecropping, which was like saying, hey, you're free now, but you still got to work on this land and you won't make enough money to ever leave. And if that wasn't bad enough, there were these apprenticeship and anti-enticement laws that made sure black people stayed poor and dependent on the very system that once enslaved them. It was like a never-ending cycle of unfairness. In the next chapters, we're going to dive deep into how these nasty laws worked and why they were created. We'll look at how these vagrancy laws, pig laws, and the convict leasing system kept the bad times rolling for African Americans. And we'll also talk about how sharecropping and those other laws kept everything locked in place, making it nearly impossible for freedmen to catch a break. The story wraps up with how these black codes eventually morphed into the Jim Crow laws, which were like the evil sequel to this whole mess, keeping segregation and discrimination alive and well for way too long. But don't worry, it also talks about the fight against these terrible laws, showing how African Americans and their allies stood up and fought for their rights, setting the stage for the civil rights movements that came later. So basically, after the Civil War, instead of letting African Americans enjoy their hard-won freedom, the South quickly cooked up these black codes to make sure they couldn't really be free. And that's what we're going to dig into: how these laws were made, how they hurt people, and how folks fought back against them. So back in 1865, when the Civil War ended and slavery was finally over, you'd think everything would be awesome for the newly freed African Americans, right? But nope, things didn't exactly go that way. Instead of just letting people live their lives in peace, the Southern states came up with these sneaky laws called the Black Codes. These laws were like the old slave codes, just with a new name. They were all about keeping black folks from making any real progress. Like, they didn't want them getting too much money, getting a good education, or even being safe in their own communities. These black codes were super harsh. For example, in Mississippi, there was a law that said black people couldn't carry guns or ammunition. So basically, they couldn't defend themselves if someone tried to hurt them. And yeah, there were a lot of people looking to cause trouble for them after the war ended. These codes were all about keeping things just like they were before, making sure the people who had been in power, mostly white folks, stayed in control and black people couldn't really get ahead. What's even worse is that these black codes weren't just about keeping people down, they were about making sure things didn't change at all. Even though the Civil War was supposed to end slavery and give African Americans their freedom, these laws were a way to make sure they still couldn't live freely. They couldn't work where they wanted, live where they wanted, or even go to school without running into all kinds of roadblocks. And it wasn't just one state doing this. These laws popped up all over the South, each one with its own twist, but all aiming for the same goal: keeping black people from really being free. So, while the Civil War was supposed to be a turning point, these black codes were like a giant step backward. Instead of moving forward and letting African Americans build better lives, the South put up these roadblocks to keep everything as close to the old ways as possible. And that's how things stayed, with these unfair rules in place, all the way into the early 20th century. It wasn't until later, when people really started pushing back, that things began to change for the better. But yeah, those black codes were a huge part of why progress was so slow and why the struggle for equality took so long. So after the Civil War, when slavery was officially over, you'd think things would get a lot better for African Americans, right? Well, not so fast. The Southern states came up with a bunch of sneaky laws called the Black Codes that were designed to keep black people from making any real progress. It was like the old rules from slavery days, but with a new name and a new twist. These black codes weren't just about being unfair, they were like a full-on attack on black people's chances to live freely and successfully. Let's look at some of the worst ones. 1. Pig laws. These laws made tiny mistakes into big crimes. Imagine getting in huge trouble for something small, like stealing a pig, hence the name. The punishments were super harsh and totally out of proportion. 2. Vagrancy laws. If you were a black man and didn't have a job, these laws could get you arrested just for that. And once you were arrested, guess what? They force you to do hard labor, like you were back on the plantation. 3. Convict leasing system. This one was brutal. If you got sent to prison, they could lease you out to do work for other people. It was like being enslaved all over again, except now it was legal. 4. Apprenticeship laws. These laws forced black kids into apprenticeships, which sounds like a way to learn a trade, but was really just another way to keep them working for almost nothing. 5. Anti-enticement laws. These laws made it illegal to try to get black workers to leave their jobs for something better. It was a way to trap them in low-paying bad jobs. 6. Sharecropping. This system was supposed to be a way for black families to work on land and share the crops with the landowner, but it ended up being a huge trap. They'd never make enough money to get ahead, and they were often cheated out of what little they did earn. So yeah, all these laws had one big goal, keeping black people down. It wasn't just about making life tough, it was about making sure they couldn't move up in the world or have real freedom. The black codes were designed to keep the old ways alive, even after slavery was supposed to be over. But here's the thing. People resisted. They fought back in all sorts of ways, big and small. This study we're diving into will break down how each of these laws worked, why they were so bad, and how people pushed against them. It's important to look at this stuff to understand just how hard the fight for freedom and equality really was, and still is. The impact of these laws stuck around for a long time, shaping life for African Americans in ways that we're still dealing with today. So yeah, it's a heavy topic, but it's one we've got to dig into to really get what was going on back then. About the author. There's a kind of gratitude that bubbles up from deep inside, not just because you survived, but because of the strength it took to keep going. My story, like so many others, is filled with hardship, pain, and faith. A faith that wasn't born out of knowing everything would be okay, but out of needing something to hold on to. I was just 7 years old when my parents abandoned me, leaving me alone in a world that didn't seem to care whether I lived or died. Growing from childhood to manhood wasn't a gradual process for me. It was more like a sudden, brutal leap. By the time I was 12, I was living on the streets, alone, with no one to rely on but myself, and nothing but sheer willpower to keep me going. The streets were my home and my battleground. Every day was a new challenge, a new test of my resolve. It was a time of intense struggle, where every breath I took was a small victory. But through all the adversity, I found a strength inside myself that I didn't even know was there. This strength wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, the kind of strength that comes from deep within. Today, I'm living proof of what perseverance and faith can do. My journey is a reminder that no matter how dark things get, there's always a little spark of hope. It was through God's grace and my own determination that I made it through those tough times. Each day was a challenge, but it shaped me into the person I am today. As I look back on the man I've become, I can't help but give thanks to the woman who's been by my side through it all. My wife, Dr. Nicole Boson Harrow. Her unwavering support, her dedication, her brilliance, these things have been my rock. Nicole's work in developmental education is nothing short of amazing. She's a force, a light, and she's shown me what it means to be truly committed to a cause, to a purpose. And to my son, Ethan, you're the reason I push myself to be better every single day. Your spirit, your drive, your energy, they inspire me in ways that are hard to put into words. As I've walked this path, I've found a way to bring together my passions, my experiences, my beliefs. I've dedicated myself to the study of history, earning both a master's and a doctoral degree, focusing on African American studies, law, and government. But for me, academics isn't just about learning facts. It's deeply personal. My academic work is intertwined with my life experiences, and they feed off each other. My time in law enforcement, which began in 2004, is a big part of that. As a police veteran, I've served with distinction, and now I'm a police lieutenant in Washington, D.C. In this role, I manage a large team of police officers and supervisors, which speaks to my leadership and my commitment to keeping the community safe. Before this, I worked as a detective in the Criminal Investigation Division, where I led high-level criminal investigations. That job taught me how to conduct thorough interviews, do meticulous research, and gather evidence with precision. These experiences, both the hardships I've faced and the professional paths I've taken, haven't just shaped who I am, they've shaped how I approach my work as a historian. I bring the same focus, the same attention to detail, and the same relentless drive for truth to my historical research as I do to my law enforcement work. Because at the end of the day, whether I'm uncovering a piece of history or investigating a crime, I'm driven by the same goal. I want to see justice done. I want to bring the truth to light, and I want to make sure that every story, every life is treated with the dignity it deserves. So, yeah, that's my story. One of grit, faith, and a whole lot of determination. And as I keep moving forward, I'll carry those lessons with me, always striving to do right by the past, the present, and the future. Chapter 1, The Pig Law. So, picture this. It's 1865, the Civil War just ended, and suddenly 4 million African Americans are free for the first time ever. Sounds amazing, right? But here's the problem. The South, which had relied on slavery for pretty much everything, wasn't exactly thrilled about this new reality. So, instead of welcoming the freedmen with open arms, they came up with ways to keep them down. Enter the pig laws. Now, these laws were pretty sneaky. They were made to criminalize really small things, like taking a chicken or a pig, stuff that might happen when someone's hungry or desperate. But here's the catch. If you broke one of these laws, even by doing something as small as picking an orange, you could end up in serious trouble. We're talking fines, jail time, and even losing your right to vote, which was a big deal because voting was one of the few ways freedmen could have a say in their new lives. Take this guy, Cuffy Washington. In 1880, he tried to vote in an election in Florida, but because he'd been caught taking 3 oranges, yes, just 3 oranges, they wouldn't let him. It's like they were looking for any excuse to stop black people from voting and getting ahead. These pig laws were just one of the many ways they kept trying to control African Americans, even after slavery was supposed to be over. So, while the freedmen were technically free, the system was stacked against them, making it super hard to actually live that freedom. And that's what these pig laws were really about, keeping the old ways going, just with a new set of rules. So, Cuffy Washington's story wasn't a one-off thing. A lot of African Americans were getting charged with really small crimes, especially when elections were around the corner. It was like someone hit a switch, and suddenly, tons of black folks were being hauled in for stuff like picking an orange or being accused of stealing a pig. Why? Because they knew that black people were likely to vote for the Republican Party, which was the party that had fought to end slavery. The Southern Democrats, who didn't want that, found a sneaky way to keep black people from voting. The pig laws. These laws weren't really about stopping crime. They were about keeping power. Alan Green, another guy caught up in this mess, saw the same pattern. Just before elections, the number of arrests would spike, and most of those arrested were black men. They'd be accused of small stuff, but the punishment was huge. They'd lose their right to vote, and that was the whole point. It was a way to make sure black voices weren't heard at the ballot box, and it worked really well. This wasn't just happening in one place either. Pippa Holloway wrote about how this was a big deal in Ocala, Florida. The pattern was clear. More petty charges and convictions right before an election. It wasn't about crime, it was about keeping control. So, what were the pig laws really about? They were a strategy to keep white supremacy going, even after slavery was officially over. By making sure black people couldn't vote or gain any real economic power, these laws kept the old system in place just under a new name. And while they didn't say they were targeting black people, in practice, that's exactly what they did. It was all about making sure that, even in freedom, African Americans were kept down and out of power. Between 1874 and 1882, Southern states were on a mission to make sure black folks, who mostly supported the Republican Party, couldn't vote. They did this by changing their state laws to punish even small crimes like theft in a way that would strip away voting rights. This was a sneaky tactic to keep the Democrats in power by shutting down a big chunk of Republican voters. Take what happened to Silas Green in Alabama, for example. Right before an election, a white guy working for the Democratic Party, Ed Williams, went up to Silas and basically scared him out of voting. Even though Silas hadn't been convicted of anything and had been cleared in court, Williams pulled out the Alabama Constitution and pointed to a rule that said anyone convicted of certain crimes couldn't vote. Silas got so freaked out that he didn't even show up to vote the next day. That's how effective these pig laws were. They didn't even need to actually convict someone. Just the threat was enough to keep black people from the polls. The story didn't stop with Silas. In Virginia, a guy named James McGuffin tried to vote in Staunton. As soon as he walked into the courthouse, a white Democrat accused him of being convicted of stealing something the year before, which would make him ineligible to vote. James denied it, and the judge actually let him vote. But as soon as he did, James was arrested right there for illegal voting. These laws were basically traps designed to keep black people from having any political power. Even if you hadn't done anything wrong, the fear of being targeted or the threat of these laws hanging over your head was enough to make many stay away from voting altogether. It was a pretty messed up system that made sure the voices of African Americans were kept out of the political process, keeping the old power structures in place. The pig laws were like super unfair rule that gave white Democrats in the South, especially in places like Virginia, a ton of power to mess with black folks. In Staunton, all it took was someone saying you broke one of these rules without any real proof, and bam, you could lose your right to vote. This happened to James McGuffin, who got arrested right after voting just because someone accused him of breaking the law, even though there was no evidence. But James wasn't the only one who got targeted. On the same day, another black man named Richard Harris tried to vote in Gloucester County, Virginia. Now, Richard couldn't read or write, so when a judge asked if he'd ever been convicted of a small crime, Richard said yes because he thought he had to tell the truth. But here's the catch. Richard had never actually been convicted of that crime. He had been accused of something else, but those charges were dropped, and he was never found guilty. Still, because of his honest mistake, the judge wouldn't let him vote. These stories show how the pig laws were used to keep black people from voting and having any say in politics. They weren't just laws, they were sneaky tricks that white Democrats used to stay in power by making sure black voices were silenced. The system was rigged against African Americans, making it super hard for them to fight back or have any real influence in their communities. So, after the Civil War, things were supposed to get better for African Americans. But it wasn't that simple. People like Richard Harris, who couldn't read or write, didn't really understand the difference between being charged with a crime and being convicted of one. This made it easy for people who didn't want black folks to vote to take advantage of them. In Richard's case, even though the charges against him were dropped, he got tricked into thinking he couldn't vote because he had been accused of something. And he wasn't alone. This kind of thing happened to a lot of black people in Virginia and other southern states. And now, the 14th Amendment was supposed to protect everyone's right to vote, but it had a loophole. It said you could lose your right to vote if you were punished for a crime, but it didn't really explain what kinds of crimes. Southern states took advantage of this and started taking away voting rights for even the smallest offenses, like petty theft or minor misdemeanors, using the pig laws. This freaked out the Republicans in Congress because they saw how the South was using these laws to stop black people from voting. So, in 1867, when Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act, they set some ground rules for the southern states. They made it clear that you could only lose your voting rights if you were convicted of a serious crime, like a felony, not just any small offense. Before this, southern states pretty much got away with using the pig laws to keep black people from voting with no real consequences. But these new rules were Congress's way of saying, enough is enough. They wanted to make sure that voting rights were protected and that people couldn't be unfairly stopped from voting just because of minor charges. Back in the 1870s, when it started to look like the federal government was serious about making sure black people in the South had their rights protected, Southern Democrats got pretty sneaky. They were determined to grab back political power, and they didn't mind using some nasty tricks to do it. Violence, lies, and straight-up cheating were their go-to moves to keep Republicans, especially black voters, away from the polls. Because most black folks were backing the Republicans, these Democrats went all out to make sure their votes didn't count. One of their main strategies, they changed up the pig laws to make it so that if you got caught for even the tiniest crime, you lose your right to vote. All the southern states jumped on this, except Texas. These pig laws weren't just rules, they were basically weapons to stop black people from having any say in politics and to keep things just like they were before the Civil War, where white folks had all the power. Here's a wild example from December 29, 1865 in Richmond, Virginia. Police were rounding up black folks left and right, throwing them in jail for breaking these unfair laws that were designed to keep them down. There's this one guy, Frank Hall, who was arrested for stealing something small. What did they do to him? Sent him to a place called Castle Thunder, which was an old Civil War prison, for a whole month. Meanwhile, George Washington, not the George Washington, just a white guy with the same name, got into trouble for being disorderly. But guess what? He walked away free. But John Lewis, a black guy charged with the same thing, got 10 days in the slammer. And it didn't stop there. Charles Reed, another black man, got busted for stealing something small, admitted he did it, and bam, another month in Castle Thunder. So what's the takeaway? The pig laws and the way they were enforced were totally messed up. They were designed to keep black people under control, punish them more harshly than white folks, and keep them out of politics. It was all part of a bigger plan to make sure white supremacy stuck around even after the Civil War was over. So here's the deal with the pig laws. They were based on this really messed up idea that black people were naturally more likely to commit certain crimes. This racist thinking was used to create laws that unfairly targeted black folks, especially when it came to taking away their right to vote. Now, while Southern Democrats were all about blocking both black and white Republicans from voting, let's be real. Their main focus was on keeping black people from having a say in anything. When the Constitution started allowing for people to lose their voting rights only if they committed serious crimes, these southern states got sneaky. They decided to reclassify minor crimes, like petty theft, as big-time felonies just to strip black people of their rights. It was a sneaky way of saying, if you steal something small, we're going to treat it like you did something way worse. By the 1870s, some southern states that hadn't been stripping anyone of their voting rights before were now doing it if someone got caught for petty larceny, which is just a fancy term for stealing small stuff. In the courts down there, they jumped on the bandwagon, deciding that even minor offenses were enough to take away someone's right to vote. As a result, more and more black folks found themselves kicked off the voting lists. Now, here's where it gets really messed up. Because of these laws, over 300,000 black citizens in the South couldn't serve on juries. That meant they had no say in the justice system at all, which only made things worse for them when it came to getting a fair trial. The Supreme Court of Mississippi even said that black people were naturally sneaky and more likely to commit certain crimes, which is just plain racist nonsense. But because of this attitude, minor crimes committed by black people were often blown out of proportion and treated as if they were major felonies, leading to much harsher punishments than what white people got for more serious crimes. In a nutshell, the pig laws were designed to keep black people down, strip them of their rights, and keep them out of the political and legal systems entirely. They were a big part of why things were so unfair for black folks in the South after the Civil War. All right, so here's what went down in Mississippi with these pig laws, and it's a real doozy. Back before 1876, if someone in Mississippi stole something worth more than $25, it was considered grand larceny, a serious crime, like a felony. But when these pig laws came into play, they totally flipped the script, especially when it came to black folks. The big change came in 1876, when Mississippi decided to lower the bar on what counted as a serious crime. Now, instead of $25, if you stole something worth just $10, boom, you were looking at a felony charge. But it gets worse. They really went after the basics, like farm animals, stuff that people, especially the newly freed black population, needed to survive. So if you took, say, a pig or a goat that was worth just one measly dollar, they'd hit you with a grand larceny charge. That's right, a felony for something as small as that. And here's the kicker. With a felony on your record, you lose your right to vote. This wasn't just about punishing people for minor theft. It was a sneaky way to keep black folks from voting and having any real power in the community. It was all part of a bigger plan to make sure that white folks stayed in control even after the Civil War was supposed to have changed everything. So basically, these pig laws were a super sneaky way of turning small-time theft into a big deal, especially for black people, and it was all about keeping them down and out of the political game. All right, so here's the lowdown on how things went from bad to worse in Mississippi and Alabama with these pig laws. Basically, the law wasn't just about catching thieves. It was a sneaky way to take away black folks' rights, especially the right to vote. Even if you took something worth less than $10, they'd slap you with a grand larceny charge, which was a big deal. This wasn't about justice. It was about keeping black people out of power by turning them into felons for the smallest offenses. Now, why was this so devastating? Well, in those days, stealing something like a chicken or a pig could land you in serious trouble, not just because of the theft, but because it meant you could no longer vote. They redefined what counted as a felony, widening the net to trap more black folks and keep them from voting. This was all about making sure white folks stayed in charge, even after slavery was supposed to be over. But it didn't stop in Mississippi. In 1875, Alabama jumped on the bandwagon too. The leaders there made some serious changes to the laws and the state constitution, targeting black citizens with even tougher rules. If you were caught stealing anything, especially something related to farming, you'd lose your right to vote forever. It was like they were saying, we'll give you freedom, but we're going to make sure you can't actually use it. So, in both Mississippi and Alabama, these pig laws were part of a bigger plan to keep black people down and out of power. It was a way to turn back the clock on all the progress made during Reconstruction and make sure that, despite being free, black folks couldn't actually enjoy the rights that freedom was supposed to bring. All right, so here's the deal. In 1875, Alabama and Arkansas cranked things up a notch by making a bunch of minor crimes into big-time felonies. This wasn't just about catching criminals, it was a sneaky way to keep black people under control. In Alabama, they expanded the list of what could get you sent to prison, making sure even the smallest offenses could land you in serious trouble. Meanwhile, in Arkansas, they made it so that stealing anything worth more than $2 was suddenly a felony. Yep, even something as small as a cow, no matter how cheap, could get you a felony conviction. So why did they do this? Well, the South was still trying to keep black folks down after slavery ended, and this was one of the tricks they used. By turning small crimes into felonies, they could take away people's right to vote and keep them from having any real power. It was all about making sure that black citizens stayed out of the political game and couldn't challenge the status quo. But it didn't stop there. These laws weren't just about taking away voting rights. They were also a key part of something even more sinister, the convict leasing system. This system basically turned black men into prisoners who could be rented out for labor, filling the gap left by slavery. By making minor crimes into big-time offenses, the South kept jails full of people they could use for cheap labor. It was a way to keep the economy running without having to pay fair wages, and it kept black men trapped in a cycle of re-enslavement, even though slavery was supposed to be over. So, in short, these pig laws were about way more than just keeping order. They were a calculated move to keep black folks from gaining power, both politically and economically, and to make sure the South stayed in control. All right, here's the lowdown. The pig laws were not just about cracking down on crime. They were a clever political move by Southern Democrats to tighten their grip on power after the Civil War. They painted a picture of rampant theft, especially livestock thefts, which hit small landowners hard because they depended on their animals for food. By pushing this narrative, Democrats managed to get lower-class whites on their side, convincing them that the real problem was the chaos brought on by the Republicans. Now, the original constitutions in the southern states didn't specifically say that people could lose their voting rights over things like petty theft, but slowly but surely, they started adding more and more minor offenses to the list of crimes that could get you disenfranchised. It was a sneaky way to sidestep the constitutional protections that were supposed to be in place after the Civil War. By expanding what counted as a felony, they could take away more and more rights from black citizens without technically breaking the new rules. In 1875, Republicans in Alabama saw what was happening and tried to sound the alarm. They went to Congress and argued that this whole reclassification of misdemeanors as felonies was just a ploy to crush the black vote and keep Democrats in power. They made it clear that these new laws weren't really about justice. They were about pushing black people back down and taking away the rights they had fought so hard to win. By turning even the smallest crimes into felonies, the Democrats were able to lock up black citizens and take away their right to vote, effectively keeping them in a state of submission. All right, here's the scoop in a way that's easy to get. So back in the day, Southern Democrats were pretty crafty. They didn't just want to punish black folks for petty crimes. They had a much bigger plan. By pushing these pig laws, they made sure that tons of black voters lost their rights, which helped them keep a tight grip on power after the Civil War. Basically, they used the law as a tool to knock down any progress black people were making and keep things the way they were before, with white folks on top. Now, some people, like white Republicans and black politicians, tried to explain why these small crimes were happening. They said, hey, these folks are stealing because they're struggling to survive. They're not criminals. They're just trying to get by in tough times. It was like they were saying, walk a mile in their shoes before you judge. But the Southern Democrats weren't having any of it. They took these petty crimes, like stealing a chicken, and blew them way out of proportion. They used these crimes to say, see, this just proves that black people aren't capable of being responsible citizens or voters. It was their way of pushing the idea that black people were somehow lesser and didn't deserve the rights that came with being a free citizen. They used these incidents to spread racist ideas and keep the system rigged in their favor. So, in the end, these laws weren't really about justice. They were about keeping black people down and maintaining control. So, back in the day, there was this messed up idea floating around that if someone started by stealing a chicken, they'd eventually move on to bigger things, like stealing a sheep. This wasn't just about stealing food to survive. It was twisted into a belief that black people couldn't control themselves and were always looking for more. The idea was that grabbing a chicken might be about feeding a hungry family, but taking a sheep, that was painted as being greedy, like they were indulging in something they didn't really need. To a lot of white folks, especially those pushing these harsh laws, this was proof that black people just didn't have the self-control to be responsible citizens. They saw it as a sign that black folks were always going to give in to their impulses, making them unfit for the rights and responsibilities that came with being a free person. It was like they were saying, if they can't resist stealing a chicken just because it's there, how can we trust them with something as important as voting? This kind of thinking wasn't just wrong, it was super damaging. It fueled a ton of hate and anger towards black people across the South. By the time the 1880s rolled around, almost every Southern state had put laws in place that were designed to strip black folks of their rights, especially targeting small crimes like stealing something minor. But these laws weren't really about stopping crime. They were about keeping black people down. The idea was that black people were somehow lesser and didn't deserve the same rights as everyone else. And this whole narrative of black people being natural-born criminals wasn't just unfair, it was a way to keep them oppressed and make sure that the power stayed with white folks. So even though slavery was technically over, these ideas kept the legacy of slavery alive and well, shaping how black people were treated for a long, long time. So there was this lady named Mamie Collins who talked about her great-grandfather's life after the Civil War. Back in the day, he was super rich, owned a ton of land, lots of slaves, which, yeah, was awful, and basically lived the high life. But when the war ended and slavery was abolished, his whole world crumbled. All that money he had was now worthless, and he couldn't handle the fact that his way of life was over. He ended up dying brokenhearted because everything he'd built was gone. Fast forward to Mamie's time. She's living on the land she inherited from him. But life is way different. She's got a small farm, some chickens and pigs, but she's super suspicious of her black neighbors. She thinks they're stealing her pigs, which honestly is just a reflection of the deep-seated racism that was all over the place back then. This kind of thinking was exactly why the pig laws were created. These laws were designed to keep black people in check by making it easy to throw them in jail for even the smallest things, like stealing a pig. But it wasn't just the pig laws that were messed up. There were also vagrancy laws that made it illegal for black people to be unemployed or even just walking around without a job. If they got caught, they'd be thrown in jail too. Both of these laws were part of a bigger plan to keep black people down, even though they were supposed to be free. It was like, okay, you're free now, but we're still going to control your every move and make life as hard as possible. These laws weren't just about punishing crime. They were about maintaining control and making sure that, even after slavery, black people still didn't have the freedom they deserved. It was all part of a nasty system designed to keep the old power structure in place, even in the so-called New South. Chapter 2, The Vagrancy Trap. So, back in the day, if you were a free black person and didn't have a job or a place to stay, you could get arrested just for that. It didn't take much. Basically, if a cop thought you looked like you didn't have a job, they could haul you in. And once you were arrested, it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. You'd get dragged in front of a judge, and if they decided you were a vagrant, which is a fancy word for someone who's unemployed or homeless, you could be forced to work somewhere, like a farm or even in jail, for up to 6 months. But here's the kicker. If you were just trying to survive, like finding shelter or refusing to work because of terrible conditions, they could keep you locked up even longer. The whole point of these laws was to make sure you ended up doing forced labor, no matter what. They'd send you to workhouses, jails, or wherever they needed cheap labor. On top of that, Virginia passed a law on January 15, 1866, that really drove this home. They were worried that too many free black people were just hanging around without jobs, and they saw this as a big problem. So, they came up with this law that said if you were caught being a vagrant, you could be forced to work for someone for up to 3 months. And guess what? The state could auction off your labor to the highest bidder. So, basically, you were back to being treated like property. And if you tried to escape from the person you were forced to work for, they'd catch you, drag you back, and make you work an extra month for free. So, not only were they trying to keep black people under control, but they were also making sure that trying to get away just made things worse. This was all part of a bigger plan to keep black people down after the Civil War, even though they were supposed to be free. These laws were like, yeah, you're free, but we're still going to make sure you don't have real freedom. So after the Civil War, even though slavery was officially over, the folks in charge down south weren't ready to let go of all that control they had over black people. They came up with these vagrancy laws, which were like a sneaky way to keep freed black people under their thumb. Basically, if you were black and didn't have a job or a home, they could arrest you for it. And the whole system was set up to make sure that even though you were free, you were still stuck in something that looked a whole lot like slavery. Here's how it worked. If they caught you and decided you were a vagrant, meaning you didn't have a job or a place to live, they could force you to work for someone, just like in the old days when you were enslaved. And if you tried to run away, they'd go all out to keep you from escaping again. They'd shackle you with a ball and chain, yep, like in those old movies, so you couldn't run. If your boss didn't want to deal with you after you tried to escape, they'd send you off to a workhouse. In these places, you'd be forced to work for the local government. And guess what? They'd slap that ball and chain on you there too, just to make sure you stayed put and kept working. So, even though on paper you were supposed to be free, these laws made sure that you were still tied down and forced to work under brutal conditions. It was like they were saying, okay, you're not a slave anymore, but we're going to make sure your life isn't much different. It was all about keeping control and making sure that even after the Civil War, the power structure didn't change too much. So, after slavery officially ended, the people running things in the South were like, okay, you're free, but we're not just going to let you live your life without some serious strings attached. They came up with these vagrancy laws that were super unfair and basically made sure black people were still stuck in a system that looked a whole lot like slavery, even though it wasn't called that anymore. Here's how they pulled it off. If you were black and didn't have a job or a place to live, they could arrest you for it. And what happened next was pretty rough. They could force you to work on public projects, like building roads or whatever else the county needed done. But here's the kicker. They'd shackle you with a heavy ball and chain to make sure you didn't try to escape. Yeah, that's right. Even after being freed, you could still end up in chains. Literally. But wait, it gets worse. If there weren't any public projects happening, they'd just hand you over to some private person who needed extra help. This person could work you hard, and guess what? You'd still be stuck with that ball and chain. And if no one wanted to take you, they'd throw you in jail, where you'd be fed nothing but bread and water. Talk about rough. These laws were a sneaky way to keep black people down, making sure they couldn't really enjoy their freedom. It was like they were saying, you might be free on paper, but we're going to do everything we can to keep you in your place. It was all part of the plan to keep things the way they were before the Civil War, making sure that black people stayed at the bottom, even though slavery was supposed to be over. So after the Civil War, Virginia came up with this law that was basically a way to keep black people in check, even though they were supposed to be free. They called it a vagrancy law. Hey. But what it really did was criminalize being poor or not having a job, stuff that a lot of newly freed people were dealing with at the time. Here's how it worked. First, if someone got kicked out of a town and then came back without permission, they could be arrested for it. Towns didn't want poor folks hanging around, so they tried to get rid of them. but if those people came back, they'd be in big trouble. Second, the law went after people who didn't have a job or couldn't take care of themselves or their families. Here's the messed up part. If someone refused to work for the low wages that the boss offered, they could be labeled a vagrant. So, even if the pay was terrible, they pretty much had to take the job, or they'd risk getting arrested. Third, if someone didn't do whatever work the boss or some local official told them to do, they'd get in trouble too. It didn't matter if the job was unfair or way too hard. If they refused, they were immediately seen as a vagrant and could be punished. Lastly, the law made it illegal to ask for help. That's right. If someone was struggling and needed food or money and asked for it, they could be arrested. This was especially cruel because it targeted people who were just trying to survive. So what you had was a system that made life almost impossible for free black people. They were free, sure, but this law made it so that if they didn't take the terrible jobs offered to them, or if they asked for help, they could end up in jail working for free again. It was a sneaky way to keep them down, even after slavery was supposed to be over. So after the Civil War, a lot of laws popped up in the South that were supposed to keep black people in their place, even though they were officially free. These were called vagrancy laws, and they were like a trap, making sure freedom didn't really mean freedom for black folks. One of the sneakiest parts of Virginia's Vagrancy Act was aimed at people who were just trying to get by, like those who were wandering around looking for family or friends that had been separated during slavery. Imagine being free but not being allowed to move around to find your loved ones or to find better opportunities. The law basically said if you didn't have a job or if you were just hanging out without a good reason, you could get arrested. So even if you were just trying to survive or reconnect with family, you could be thrown in jail. The law went further, saying that anyone who didn't have a job, a way to make money, or a place to stay, and couldn't explain what they were doing, was breaking the law. Think about it. Most newly freed black people didn't have much of anything. They had no money, no job, and no home because they'd just been released from slavery. So this law made it illegal to just exist if you were poor and trying to figure out your next move. In a nutshell, these vagrancy laws were designed to keep black people down. They were free on paper, but the laws made sure they couldn't actually live freely. Instead of being able to move forward with their lives, they were stuck in a system that was almost as bad as slavery, just with a different name. So after the Civil War, even though black people were officially free, the South wasn't ready to let them live like it. They came up with these laws called vagrancy laws, which were like sneaky traps to keep black people under control. These laws weren't really about keeping the peace. They were more about keeping black folks working for free, just like before. But now it was all legal. Here's how it worked. If you were black and didn't have a job, or if you were just hanging out without a good reason, you could get arrested. Then, instead of just sitting in jail, they'd hire you out to someone who needed cheap labor, basically making you work without paying you much, if anything at all. It was like a new form of slavery, but they dressed it up as law and order. These laws weren't just a one-off thing in Virginia. After they got the ball rolling, other states like Alabama jumped on board with their own versions. The trick was, these laws didn't come out and say they were just for black people, but everyone knew that's who they were targeting. It was all part of the plan to keep the old ways alive, making sure black people couldn't really be free, couldn't move up in life, and had to stay working for the same folks who kept them down before. In a nutshell, these vagrancy laws were a sneaky way to re-enslave black people, keeping them stuck in a system that was designed to make sure they never really got a chance to be free and independent. The laws looked like they were about keeping things in order, but really they were just about keeping things the same. After the Civil War, the Southern states cooked up some pretty shady laws to keep black people down, even though they were supposed to be free. One of the worst tricks they pulled was with these vagrancy laws. In places like Alabama, they had super vague rules that said if you were black and didn't have a job or enough money to support yourself, you could be labeled a vagrant. Basically, if you were just trying to figure things out after being freed, they could arrest you for it. These laws weren't really about keeping the peace. They were all about keeping black folks working for the same white folks who had controlled them before. The laws made it super easy to scoop up black people off the streets, call them vagrants, and then force them to work, usually for little or no money, under conditions that were almost as bad as slavery. So, what was the point? It was all about keeping cheap labor around for white landowners and making sure that black people couldn't really enjoy their freedom. Even though slavery was supposed to be over, These laws made sure that African Americans were still stuck in a system that exploited them and kept them down. And it didn't stop there. They also had something called enticement laws, which were like handcuffs for anyone who was trying to get a better job. If a black person was under contract to work for someone, these laws made it illegal for anyone else to offer them a better deal. That meant once you were stuck in a bad job, you couldn't leave for something better. You were trapped, just like before. In short, these laws were designed to keep African Americans from moving up in the world, making sure that their so-called freedom was just a word, not something they could actually live out. So after the Civil War, a bunch of sneaky laws popped up to keep African Americans from actually enjoying their freedom. One of the worst was the anti-migrant agent laws. These laws made it almost impossible for people who helped workers move to new jobs in other states to do their job. They slapped on huge fees that nobody could afford to pay, so basically, black folks were stuck where they were, forced to stay in terrible jobs with no way out. These laws were part of a bigger trap. They worked hand in hand with other rules, like the enticement laws, which made sure if you were locked into a crappy job, you couldn't just quit and find something better. Together, these laws were designed to keep black people working under awful conditions, kind of like they were still enslaved, but now with a fancy legal name slapped on it. It was like saying, yeah, you're free, but not really fair. Now, here's where it gets even worse, the vagrancy laws. These were super vague rules that gave cops the power to arrest just about any black person they wanted. If you were just trying to live your life but didn't have a job or enough money, they could throw you in jail just for that. And once you were locked up, the situation got ugly fast. Inside jail, you didn't just sit there. They give you this nasty choice. You could either rot in jail or sign a contract to work for some white dude who bailed you out. But here's the catch. The work conditions were brutal, and it was pretty much like being a slave again. You didn't have any real choice or freedom. It was just another way to keep black people down and trapped in a system that was supposed to have ended when slavery was abolished. In a nutshell, these laws were all about making sure that African Americans couldn't really break free from the cycle of exploitation. They were set up to look like regular laws, but in reality, they were just sneaky ways to keep the old racist systems alive. So, after the Civil War, when slavery was supposed to be over, a bunch of laws popped up that were basically designed to keep black people in chains, just in a sneakier way. These laws were like a fake out, pretending to be about keeping the peace, but really just a way to trap freedmen back into forced labor. One of the worst tricks was the convict labor laws mixed with the surety system. Here's how it worked. If you got picked up for something like not having a job, which they called vagrancy, you get thrown in jail. But instead of just sitting in jail, you could be bailed out by some employer. Sounds good, right? Not really, because once you were bailed out, you had to work for that employer under some really harsh conditions. It was like, hey, you're free to work for me in terrible conditions. And if nobody bailed you out, you got stuck in a chain gang, working long hours with no way out, which was pretty much like being a slave all over again. This system was messed up because it wasn't about justice or helping people get back on their feet. It was about keeping black folks down, making sure they couldn't really enjoy the freedom they were supposed to have. The whole thing was designed to crush their spirits and keep them in a cycle where they couldn't escape the oppression that had supposedly ended. Take Alabama's vagrancy law, for example. It was super strict, making it illegal for almost anyone to wander around or ask for help unless they were blind or couldn't work. If you got caught, you were labeled a vagrant or a tramp, which meant you were automatically in trouble and could be forced into labor. It got even worse if you left your home county and got caught doing anything that looked like vagrancy. You were in even bigger trouble. So, in a nutshell, these laws weren't really about keeping order. They were about keeping African Americans locked into a system that looked a lot like slavery, even though it was wrapped up in legal terms. The whole thing was a cruel joke, where the promise of freedom was just that, a promise with no real freedom behind it. So, after the Civil War, you'd think that being freed meant you were finally free, right? Well, not so fast. Alabama, along with other southern states, came up with these sneaky laws called vagrancy laws that were really just a way to keep black people trapped in a tough situation. Here's the kicker. These laws didn't just target adults, they went after kids too. Imagine being under 16 and just hanging out with someone labeled as a vagrant. Basically, someone who didn't have a job or a place to stay. Boom! Just like that, you'd be branded as a vagrant yourself, even if you didn't do anything wrong. That meant you could be arrested and forced to work no matter how young or innocent you were. These laws were part of something bigger and much darker called the Black Codes. These codes were like a blueprint for keeping the old ways alive, the ones where black people were under the control of white folks. The vagrancy laws were a way to push freed slaves and their kids right back into the same old system they had just escaped from. It was like saying, sure, you're free now, but we've got a bunch of new rules that pretty much make sure you stay stuck in the same bad spot. The scariest part? If your parents were caught up in this mess, you were automatically sucked into it too. That meant even kids could be dragged into this system, forced to work under harsh conditions just because of who they were hanging out with. The whole setup was designed to keep black families from truly breaking free from the old system, making sure they stayed in a position where they couldn't rise up or get ahead. So, freedom? Not really. These laws were all about keeping people down, no matter how hard they tried to move up. So, here's the deal. After the Civil War, you'd think freedom meant being free, right? But nope, not if you were in Alabama. The state came up with these vagrancy laws that were really just a sneaky way to keep black families stuck in tough situations. And get this, they didn't just target adults, they went after kids too. If you were under 16 and didn't have someone watching over you the way the state thought they should, you could be labeled a ward of the state. That basically meant the government could step in and take you away from your parents. And what would they do with you? They'd slap you with a forced labor contract, making you work like you were still in slavery, even though you were supposed to be free. It was a super harsh system that broke families apart and kept them down even after they were supposed to be free. But wait, it gets worse. The state didn't just go after kids who were hanging out with the wrong people. They also said that if your parents couldn't provide a suitable home or a way to make an honest living, like if they were struggling to get by, which a lot of freedmen were, you could be labeled a vagrant too. That meant the state could take you away and put you to work, just like they did with adults. So, instead of actually being free, these laws made sure that black families stayed trapped in a system that was a lot like slavery. It wasn't just about keeping order. It was all about making sure the old rules stayed in place, even after slavery was supposed to be over. The law was like a big trap, ready to catch anyone who didn't fit into the state's idea of what freedom should look like. And once you were caught, it was nearly impossible to break free. So, picture this. Alabama, after the Civil War, decided they weren't too keen on this whole freedom thing for former slaves. They came up with these black code laws that were super sneaky. They were like, sure, you're free, but if you mess up even a little bit, we're going to fine you $50. Now, imagine you're a freedman, someone who's just gained their freedom, but you don't have $50 lying around. What happens then? They drag you off to a public auction and sell your labor to the highest bidder for 6 months. It's like, congrats, you're free, but surprise, you're not really free. After your 6 months of working for whoever bought you, you'd think, finally, I'm done. But nope, you still have to go back to finish your original contract with some overseer. It's like they're saying, you're free to work for us forever. These laws were just a clever way to keep the old system going without actually calling it slavery. They made sure that even though the law said slavery was over, the reality for many black folks was that they were still stuck in a cycle of work and punishment. Now, Alabama wasn't the only state pulling these tricks. Florida and Louisiana were right there too, coming up with their own nasty vagrancy laws. In Florida, they basically decided that if you didn't have a steady job or if you were found just hanging around with no money, you were a vagrant. And being labeled a vagrant was bad news. It meant they could arrest you, and before you knew it, you'd be caught up in the same mess, working off your so-called debt or just being forced to work because you didn't have the right kind of life. So, even though these laws were dressed up as a way to keep order, they were really just a sneaky way to keep black people under control, making sure they couldn't truly break free from the old ways. It was like putting the same old chains back on but calling it something new. So, Florida decided to take its vagrancy laws to the next level, making sure almost anyone could get caught up in their legal net. They didn't just go after adults, they went after kids too. If you were a guy over 18 and you didn't have a job or were just hanging around, bam, you could be labeled a vagrant. And trust me, that was bad news. But Florida didn't stop there. They were like, hey, let's make sure we can control everyone, even the little ones. So if you were a kid and your family was poor, or if you didn't have a home, or heck, if you were just out there trying to sell something to make a few cents, they'd slap that vagrant label on you. Even if you were just living in a rough situation at home, it didn't matter. The law could still grab you and toss you into this whole messed up system. Basically, Florida's vagrancy laws were like this big, nasty trap. They weren't really about keeping the peace. They were about keeping the old power structures in place. It was a way to make sure that African Americans and poor folks couldn't get ahead, keeping them stuck in a cycle of poverty and forced labor. These laws made sure that nearly anyone who was struggling could be pulled into the system and forced to work for someone else, all while pretending it was just about law and order. And for the kids, they didn't stand a chance. If life was tough, the law made it even tougher, dragging them into a system that treated them like criminals just for trying to survive. It was like the state was saying, we're going to keep things the way they were before the war, no matter what it takes. Florida's laws were like a heavy-handed bully, always ready to swoop in and make life even tougher for those already struggling. And they didn't just stop at adults. They went after kids too. Imagine being a kid who plays an instrument or sings a song to make a little money. In Florida, that innocent act could get you labeled as a vagrant. Yep, just playing music or performing for a few coins could land you in hot water. And if you were under 17, hanging out with the wrong crowd or just being perceived as lazy could get you branded a vagrant too. But it didn't end there. If a kid broke any state law, city rule, or even a small town regulation, they could be sucked into this system. Even the smallest mistake could label them as a troublemaker, leading to harsh consequences. These laws weren't about keeping the peace. They were about keeping control, especially over African American kids. They were designed to keep vulnerable children trapped in a cycle of poverty and forced labor, all under the guise of enforcing the law. And as if that wasn't enough, Florida made it illegal for any freedman or person of color to own or carry a weapon without a license. But getting that license? Almost impossible. You needed the recommendation of 2 white men, which was about as likely as snow in July, considering the racial prejudice of the time. This law wasn't really about safety. It was about keeping black people defenseless and easy to control. In short, Florida's laws were a way to keep the social order exactly as it was before the Civil War, with African Americans and the poor stuck at the bottom, unable to rise up or defend themselves. It was a system rigged against them from the start, disguised as justice, but really just another form of oppression. All right, so here's the deal. Back in the day, if you were a freedman in the South and didn't follow every rule to the letter, the consequences were downright cruel. Let's say you were caught with something as simple as a weapon without a license, which, by the way, was nearly impossible to get. The punishment? First, you'd be put in a pillory, which is basically a public humiliation station where everyone could mock you for an hour. But that wasn't the end of it. Afterward, you get whipped. 39 lashes right on your bare back. This wasn't just about breaking the rules, it was the state's way of reminding you who was in charge, trying to keep you scared and controlled. And it wasn't just about weapons. In places like Florida, they had laws that made it illegal for African Americans to run a business or practice any trade. So if you wanted to be a shopkeeper, a carpenter, or anything that could give you some independence, tough luck. The law shut that down fast. They didn't want freedmen getting too comfortable or gaining any real freedom. Instead, they pushed everyone back into roles as servants or forced laborers, making sure that African Americans stayed at the bottom of the social ladder. These laws weren't just random rules. They were carefully designed to keep the old ways of slavery alive, just under a different name. By making it illegal for African Americans to defend themselves or earn a decent living, states like Florida and Louisiana were making sure that the power dynamic stayed the same, even after the Civil War. The goal was to keep African Americans dependent on and controlled by a system that wanted to see them remain powerless. Take Louisiana, for example. On December 20th, 1865, the state passed a vagrancy law that was pretty much a copy of an old one from 1855. This law targeted anyone who didn't have a job or a clear way to support themselves. If you were found hanging out in places like taverns, sheds, or even just on the streets without a job, you'd be labeled a vagrant. And that label came with all sorts of harsh consequences. The law even went after people who were just trying to survive, begging for food or money, or even those who couldn't take care of their families due to poverty. It was all part of a bigger plan to keep African Americans down, making it nearly impossible for them to truly enjoy the freedom they've been promised. All right, here's the scoop. Louisiana's vagrancy laws were pretty harsh, and they had a lot in common with similar laws up north, like in Massachusetts, New York, and Maine. If a freedman got hit with a vagrancy charge in Louisiana, things could go downhill fast. The punishment? he might be forced to work for up to a year, or be put to work on public projects like roads and levees. Basically, they turned a legal sentence into forced labor. Now, folks who supported this law claimed it was necessary to keep order in the South, saying that all the newly freed slaves were just sitting around causing trouble. But let's be real, that's not what was really going on. The true goal of this law was to control African Americans, keep them dependent, and continue exploiting their labor, just like before the Civil War ended. This wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was a sneaky way to keep things the way they'd always been, with black people still stuck under the thumb of white folks, even though they were supposed to be free. What's wild is that this wasn't just a Southern thing. By copying laws from northern states like Massachusetts, Louisiana showed that both the North and South were on the same page when it came to using the law to keep black people down. These vagrancy laws weren't about solving real problems. They were about holding on to a social order that kept African Americans oppressed. Whether in the North or the South, these laws were all about making sure that even after slavery ended, black people stayed trapped in the same cycle of exploitation and control. Now, take South Carolina's vagrancy law. It was basically part of a bigger web of black codes spread across the South, designed to keep African Americans in line. The law was super vague on purpose, defining a vagrant as just about anyone who didn't have a permanent home or enough money to live off of. It targeted the newly freed people, making sure they were still tied down by an unfair legal system. And get this, if you owned land but weren't farming it, South Carolina's law could say you were breaking the rules. That meant you could be punished just for not using your land the way some judge thought you should. It didn't stop there either. If you tried to make a living by performing in plays or entertaining folks without a license, guess what? You were breaking the law again. So they weren't just controlling where you lived or how you worked. They were even trying to control how you expressed yourself. In the end, these laws were all about keeping African Americans from really being free. They were designed to make sure that, even after slavery ended, black people couldn't truly escape the control of a society that didn't want them to succeed. These laws weren't about safety or order. They were about holding on to power and keeping a whole group of people stuck in a system that never really let them go. All right, here's the deal. South Carolina's vagrancy law, just like the ones in other southern states, wasn't really about keeping the peace. It was about keeping control. The law was designed to make sure that African Americans, even though they were supposed to be free, stayed stuck in a place where they were always at risk of getting in trouble for just living their lives. By making it illegal to be idle, own land that wasn't being farmed, or perform without a license, the law basically set things up so that freedmen were constantly looking over their shoulders, worried they might get hit with a legal charge for doing something as simple as walking around or trying to make a living. This wasn't just about making sure everyone followed the rules, it was about keeping a social order that still gave all the power to white people while making sure black people couldn't really get ahead. Now, let's talk about Mississippi's vagrancy law from 1865. This law was all about tightening the screws on the newly freed African Americans. It said that anyone who was hanging out in public places like cities, towns, or near things like steamboat landings and railroad stations. Railroad stations could be labeled a vagrant, basically a troublemaker. The language of this law wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate move to make it almost impossible for freedmen to go anywhere without breaking the law. What does that mean? Well, it meant that if you were black and you just happened to be near a train station or a boat landing, you could get arrested just for being there. This wasn't just about limiting where you could go. It was about making it super hard for African Americans to move around and find better opportunities. It trapped them in one place and kept them poor. And if you got caught and convicted under this law, things got real bad. The first time, you'd be locked up for at least 10 days, maybe up to 30. If it happened again, you could be looking at up to 6 months behind bars. And to make it worse, you had to pay for your own arrest and time in jail. If you couldn't pay, you'd stay in. All right. So here's what was going down in Mississippi with these vagrancy laws. If you were an African American and you didn't have a job lined up by a certain date, you were automatically labeled a vagrant. What did that mean? It meant you could be thrown in jail and forced into contract labor. Yep, that's right. Basically, you were back to being a slave, just under a different label. The whole idea was to keep African Americans working in conditions that were eerily similar to the slavery they had supposedly been freed from. But it didn't stop there. Mississippi's laws also had some of the harshest punishments for things like interracial marriage. If a white person and a black person decided to get married, they weren't just breaking some social taboo. They were committing a crime so serious that it could land them in prison for life. This was all about keeping races separate and making sure that African Americans stayed in their place, according to the twisted rules of the time. These laws weren't just about keeping order, they were about keeping control. By making it a crime to even be unemployed or to gather with white people in a way that suggested equality, Mississippi was doing everything it could to force African Americans back into a position of complete subjugation. These laws were a way to make sure that the freedom African Americans had fought for didn't actually give them the chance to live free. So when we talk about Mississippi's 1866 Vagrancy Act, it wasn't just a law on the books, it was a weapon. It was designed to make sure that African Americans remained trapped in a system that kept them down, no matter what the Constitution said about their rights. By criminalizing everything from unemployment to interracial relationships, these laws made it nearly impossible for African Americans to truly break free from the chains of slavery, even after the Civil War had ended. All right, so here's how Mississippi's Vagrancy Act worked, and it was just as messed up as you'd expect. The law didn't just go after African Americans, it also took aim at white guys who were in relationships with black women. If a white man was caught in an affair, or even just hanging out with a black woman, he was slapped with a $50 fine. Now, here's where it gets even more twisted. If he couldn't come up with the cash in 5 days, the sheriff could basically sell his labor to cover the fine. Yep, they were still finding ways to make people work for free, just like in the days of slavery. This whole setup was about one thing: keeping control. Even though slavery was supposed to be over, the state found sneaky ways to keep the system alive. They used these laws to make sure African Americans and anyone who associated with them stayed in a position of powerlessness. By hiring out people who couldn't pay their fines, the state made sure they could still profit off of forced labor. It was like a bad sequel to slavery with all the same terrible plot points. Mississippi's 1866 Vagrancy Act wasn't just some random law. It was a carefully crafted tool to keep white supremacy intact and to make sure African Americans never got a real taste of freedom. By turning things like unemployment, hanging out with the wrong people, or even just existing into crimes, the state trapped African Americans in a vicious cycle. They were constantly being punished, pushed into poverty, and forced into hard labor, just like before the Civil War. The vagrancy laws across the South were brutal. They didn't just restrict where African Americans could go. They practically criminalized their existence. If you broke these laws, you could expect to be whipped, locked up, and then thrown into the convict leasing system, where you'd be working in conditions that were barely any better than slavery. So even though the Civil War was supposed to bring freedom, these laws made sure that for many African Americans, real freedom was still just out of reach. All right, so here's the deal with these vagrancy laws. They were supposed to be about keeping things in order, but really, they were just another way to keep African Americans down. The state made it a crime for people to do basic things like looking for a job or even just being out in public. Once someone got busted under these laws, they were basically rented out to private businesses, where they faced the same kind of brutal treatment that slavery was all about. It wasn't just a technicality, it was a sneaky plan to keep the old ways alive, even though slavery was supposed to be over. These vagrancy laws were like a reboot of the old system, making sure that African Americans stayed stuck in a life where freedom was just out of reach. The South wasn't ready to let go of its control, so they used these laws to keep the racial and economic pecking order in place. For many African Americans, the end of slavery didn't bring the freedom they hoped for. It just kicked off a new chapter in the fight for real equality. Chapter 3, Shackles of Convict Leasing System. I think God intended the niggers to be slaves. Now, since man has deranged God's plan, I think the best we can do is keep them as near to a state of bondage as possible. My theory is feed them well, clothe them well, and then, if they don't work, whip them well. All right, so after the Civil War ended, a lot of Southern folks weren't ready to give up their old ways of thinking. Even though they couldn't legally own slaves anymore, they still wanted to control black people and keep them as close to slavery as possible. This messed up idea that African Americans were naturally criminals started spreading, and it became a big problem. People in the South, especially the white planters who lost their slaves, began to see black folks as troublemakers just because they were trying to survive. With no jobs, no homes, and barely any food, many freedmen had to steal just to get by. They weren't stealing because they wanted to. They were desperate and starving. But instead of understanding that, a lot of people just saw them as criminals. For example, stealing food like pigs, chickens, or even just a few ears of corn was super common among the freedmen. It wasn't that they were bad people. They were just trying to survive in a world that wasn't giving them a fair shot. Even some people back then, like a woman in Mississippi and a military commander named General Ord, noticed how tough things were for the freedmen. They saw that these folks were stealing food out of sheer desperation, not because they were criminals at heart. So, this whole idea that black people were naturally criminals was really just a way for Southern whites to justify keeping them down and controlling them, even after slavery was supposed to be over. It was a sad and unfair way to view people who were just trying to make it in a harsh, unforgiving world. So, after the Civil War, a lot of people in the South still wanted to keep African Americans under control, even though slavery was supposed to be over. They came up with all these laws like vagrancy laws and black codes to make sure black people stayed poor and powerless. The idea that black folks were naturally criminals just because they were struggling to survive was used to justify treating them really badly. It was like they found a way to bring back slavery without calling it that. Take this guy, Edmund Richardson, for example. He was a rich guy from North Carolina who owned a bunch of slaves and made a fortune before the Civil War. But when the war ended, he lost almost everything. Instead of starting over the honest way, Richardson saw a chance to rebuild his empire by exploiting the freedmen who were now stuck in the prison system because of these unfair laws. Mississippi's prisons were full of former slaves who got locked up for things like not having a job or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The state made a deal with Richardson. They'd give him all this free labor and he'd take care of the prisoners' basic needs like food and clothing. But here's the kicker. While the state paid Richardson to keep the prisoners alive, he got to keep all the money they made working on his plantations. So, while the freedmen were technically free, they ended up back in the same kind of brutal labor they'd just escaped from. Richardson's story is a pretty messed up example of how people in the South tried to hold on to their old ways by finding loopholes in the law. They turned freedom into a joke, making sure that, even though the freedmen were no longer slaves, they were still trapped in a system designed to keep them down and working for someone else's profit. All right, so here's what went down. After the Civil War, even though slavery was officially over, a lot of rich folks in the South were not ready to give up their control over black people. They came up with something called convict leasing, which was basically a sneaky way to keep African Americans working for free, just like in the old days of slavery. One of the guys who really cashed in on this was Edmund Richardson. He was a wealthy dude from North Carolina who had made a ton of money before the war, but lost most of it when slavery ended. But Richardson wasn't about to give up. He made a deal with the state of Mississippi. The state had a bunch of African Americans locked up because of these unfair laws that made it super easy to get arrested, like for not having a job or just being in the wrong place. The state couldn't afford to keep them all in prison, so they let Richardson take them. He was supposed to feed and take care of these guys, but instead, he worked them to the bone on his cotton plantations. The state paid him to do this, but Richardson got to keep all the money made from their hard work. It was like slavery never ended. This wasn't just a one-time thing. Richardson's deal with the state started a whole system across the South where African Americans were arrested for tiny things, then leased out to work in horrible conditions. It was a way to keep the old racist system going even after slavery was officially over. These workers weren't in regular prisons. They were sent to coal mines, sawmills, railroads, and back to the same plantations where they or their families had been slaves. Richardson was smart in a really bad way. He made sure the few white prisoners stayed in a regular jail while sending all the black prisoners to do the toughest, most dangerous jobs out in the Delta. The conditions were so bad that a lot of people didn't survive. But for guys like Richardson, that didn't matter. They just wanted the profits. This whole system was really about keeping African Americans down, making sure they couldn't get ahead even though they were supposed to be free. It's a harsh reminder that just because the law said slavery was over, it didn't mean the fight for freedom and equality was won. The system was rigged to keep black people stuck in the same old cycle of hard labor and unfair treatment, and it took a long time for things to even start getting better. All right, here's the scoop. After the Civil War, some rich folks in the South, like Edmund Richardson, weren't ready to give up their grip on black labor. Even though slavery was officially over, They found a new way to keep African Americans working under terrible conditions. They called it convict leasing, but it was really just slavery with a new name. Richardson, who had lost a lot of his wealth after the war, made a deal with Mississippi to get his hands on cheap labor. The state had locked up a bunch of African Americans for breaking unfair laws like not having a job or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Instead of keeping them in prison, Mississippi handed them over to Richardson to work on his plantations. The official reports tried to make it seem like everything was fine, claiming the convicts worked cheerfully and that punishments were rare. But the truth was much darker. These men were forced to do the hardest, dirtiest jobs you can imagine, like building levees and clearing swamps under horrible conditions, and a lot of them didn't survive. Some escaped, but many died from disease or injuries. Still, the state didn't really care about these deaths. Instead, people were more impressed with how rich Richardson got from all this. By 1880, Richardson was rolling in cash. He owned fancy mansions, a huge plantation, banks, steamboats, and even railroads. He controlled the largest textile plant in the Lower South and had 36 cotton plantations. All this wealth came from exploiting black convicts, who were forced to work for almost nothing. Richardson's story shows how, even after the Civil War, some folks were determined to keep things the way they were, using new laws to continue the same old oppression. Richardson's success was a reminder that just because slavery was over didn't mean that the fight for freedom and equality was won. The convict leasing system allowed guys like Richardson to rebuild their fortunes on the backs of people who were supposed to be free, keeping the old racial hierarchy alive and well. It's a tough story, but it's important to understand how deeply rooted these systems of oppression were, and how hard it was to break free from them. All right, let's break it down. After the Civil War, Edmund Richardson became one of the wealthiest men in the South by exploiting a system called convict leasing. This was a shady practice where African Americans, many of whom were unfairly arrested under strict laws, were forced to work for free or very little pay. Richardson's company, Richardson and May, handled a whopping 250,000 bales of cotton every year, making him a big deal in the Southern economy. Newspapers praised him as one of the greatest Southern businessmen, even calling him the largest cotton planter in the world. But here's the twist. Richardson liked to think of himself as the best friend of the people he was exploiting, which is pretty messed up. He loved to tell stories about how some of his former slaves, who were given to him as wedding gifts way back in 1840, were still working for him by 1880. According to Richardson, these folks were so happy with their lives that they didn't want to leave, even after they were technically free. But what he didn't mention was the power dynamics at play, how these so-called happy conditions were anything but. Richardson used this narrative to cover up the harsh reality. The people working for him, especially those in the convict leasing system, endured conditions that were often worse than slavery. He made it sound like he was a kind and caring boss, but the truth was that he was profiting from their suffering and keeping the same old racist system alive under a new name. Richardson's story is a reminder that just because slavery was officially over didn't mean the exploitation stopped. His wealth and success were built on the backs of African Americans who were still trapped in a cycle of forced labor. While he enjoyed a life of luxury, the people working for him were stuck in grueling conditions with little hope of escaping. The convict leasing system wasn't just about making money. It also deepened the divisions and inequalities that had existed in the South for generations. It created a toxic environment where the rich got richer and the poor, especially African Americans, were left to suffer. Even within the political system, there were contradictions. Some Republican leaders, both black and white, pushed for more voting rights for freedmen because it boosted their political power. But at the same time, they operated within a system that was full of moral compromises. In 1870, Governor James Alcorn of Mississippi saw firsthand just how brutal this system was. He witnessed a group of convicts, shackled and guarded by armed men, being marched under the watchful eyes of overseers who had the power to kill or severely beat them for the slightest mistake. These acts of violence were often carried out without any legal consequences, showing just how deeply rooted the system of exploitation and control remained in the South. So, while people like Richardson were living large, the harsh reality for many African Americans was a life of forced labor and constant danger, showing that the fight for true freedom was far from over. All right, let's put it in simple terms. Governor Alcorn of Mississippi seemed like he was on the right track when he publicly called out the brutal treatment of convicts working under the convict leasing system. It looked like he was ready to take a stand against this terrible system that basically kept slavery alive even after the Civil War ended. But then, just a few months later, he did something that totally contradicted his words. He extended the contract for the very system he criticized. This move showed that even when people knew the convict leasing system was horrible, they still went along with it because it was too profitable to shut down. The South was desperate to recover economically after the Civil War, and the money made from exploiting African Americans through convict leasing was just too tempting to give up. Governor Alcorn's decision is a perfect example of the tough choices and moral compromises people made back then. Even though he knew how bad the system was, he still chose to keep it going, showing how deeply tied the South's economy was to this new form of slavery. The reality was that making money often took priority over doing the right thing, no matter the cost in human lives. In this messed up system, the lines between rich and poor, and even between former masters and former slaves, got blurry. The wealthy kept getting richer by exploiting others, while the poor, especially African Americans, continued to suffer. The old divisions from before the Civil War were just rebranded in a new, equally cruel way. Extending Richardson's contract, despite knowing how brutal it was, showed just how hard it was going to be to break free from these cycles of exploitation. Before the war, we owned the Negroes. If a man had a good nigger, he could afford to take care of him. If he was sick, get a doctor. He might even put gold plugs in his teeth. But these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another. After the Civil War, freedom for over 400,000 formerly enslaved people in Mississippi quickly turned into something else entirely. Even though they were technically free, the way the law was applied made it feel like they were still trapped in a system designed to keep them down. In towns where African Americans and white people lived in similar numbers, the difference in how they were treated by the police was shocking. For example, in August 1866, the local jail in Natchez only had 9 white men, but it was packed with 67 freedmen. Fast forward to November 1874, in Columbus, and the entire jail population was made up of 53 African Americans, no white people at all. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern seen all over Mississippi. In Vicksburg, between March 1886 and February 1887, 426 freedmen were locked up, compared to just 20 white folks. And it wasn't any better in workhouses, where nearly 1,000 freedmen were held, alongside only 442 white people. What this shows is that the justice system was being used to keep African Americans in check, even after slavery was supposed to be over. Instead of enjoying their freedom, many found themselves caught up in a system that seemed to be designed to criminalize them and take away their rights all over again. The over-policing and mass imprisonment of African Americans weren't just about keeping the peace. It was a deliberate way to keep control over people who had just won their freedom. The jails and workhouses became the new plantations, where the spirit of slavery lived on through the unfair treatment and incarceration of freedmen. For those who got arrested, it wasn't just about spending time in jail. Because they usually couldn't afford to pay their fines, they ended up being leased out for labor. This system forced them back into conditions that felt a lot like the slavery they'd just escaped from. It was like freedom was dangled in front of them, only to be yanked away by a system that still saw them as less than equal. In the years after the Civil War, things didn't get much easier for black people, especially in the South. Even though they were supposed to be free, a lot of them ended up in situations that were just as bad as slavery. It wasn't just black men who were mistreated. Black women were also forced into chain gangs, where they had to work in public, shackled together, for everyone to see. These chain gangs were a harsh reminder to everyone that, despite the end of slavery, racial stereotypes and discrimination were alive and well. The way prisoners were treated depended a lot on their race. There was a strong belief that white people shouldn't be subjected to the degrading conditions of a chain gang. In fact, it was so frowned upon that if a white person somehow ended up in a chain gang, the overseer, the person in charge, would often have to pay a fine, almost like they were apologizing for mixing up the racial order. These chain gangs weren't just about punishing people for breaking the law, they were a way to keep black people in their place. By arresting African Americans for minor offenses, local authorities were basically trying to bring back slavery, just in a different form. The whole system was rigged to make sure that black people stayed at the bottom, no matter what. When people were arrested for small crimes, like stealing food to survive, they were usually sent to the county jail. But these jails were quickly overwhelmed because the police were arresting so many black people. When there was no more room in the jail, the authorities didn't just let people off the hook. They came up with another cruel punishment: public flogging at a whipping post. This whipping post was a throwback to the days of slavery. It was a way to publicly humiliate and physically punish black people, keeping them scared and under control. For minor crimes that might have earned a short jail sentence, African Americans instead faced the whipping post, a brutal reminder that their supposed freedom didn't mean they were truly free. The system was set up to keep them down, and even the smallest mistake could lead to a painful, degrading punishment in front of everyone. So, while the law claimed to be about maintaining order, it was really about keeping black people oppressed. The authorities used these brutal punishments to send a message. Even though slavery was over, the old ways of control and domination were still very much in play. All right, so back in 1875, Mississippi was feeling the heat from taxpayers who were tired of paying for prisoners. So the Republican lawmakers decided, hey, why not lease out these convicts to anyone willing to take care of them? This was a huge change because it turned prisoners into a kind of business opportunity. It wasn't long before the Democrats took control and decided to run with this idea. They passed a law that gave local officials the power to work or lease out convicts however they wanted, making sure this practice spread across both the countryside and the cities. Fast forward to 1892, and things took an even darker turn. The state passed a new law that made it mandatory for convicts to be leased out if counties didn't already have deals in place with contractors. This meant that employers and landlords got first dibs on convict labor, and the convicts themselves had zero say in the matter. They were basically handed over to these new bosses without any choice, stuck in a system that controlled their every move. Throughout Mississippi, counties were quick to jump on board with this convict leasing system. Contractors would lease prisoners from the state and then, in some cases, release them to other employers, creating a whole web of exploitation that looked a lot like the old slave trade. So, even though African Americans were supposed to be free, they found themselves back in a situation that felt a lot like slavery, forced to work under harsh conditions with no control over their own lives. This system didn't just keep African Americans trapped in a cycle of hard labor, it also kept the old social order intact. The rich and powerful white elites continued to grow their wealth, while black people were denied the freedoms and opportunities they were promised after slavery ended. This convict leasing system became a key part of the Southern economy, making sure that the balance of power stayed the same, with African Americans still struggling for the freedom they deserved. So, after the Civil War, things were supposed to be getting better for African Americans, but in Mississippi, that wasn't the case at all. The state came up with a convict leasing system that was brutal, making life for those caught in it even worse than life in prison. This system wasn't just about using convict labor to make money. It was also about keeping African Americans in a position that was pretty close to slavery. When the Democrats got back in power, they passed a law that really targeted African Americans. They changed the rules so that stealing anything worth more than $10, or any cattle or pigs, no matter how much they were worth, was considered a major crime called grand larceny. This law, which people started calling the pig law, made sure that even small thefts could land someone in big trouble. If convicted, freedmen could be sent to the state penitentiary for up to 5 years. But here's the kicker. Once someone was convicted under this law, they could be leased out to work for the whole length of their sentence, and it didn't matter if they agreed to it or not. This meant that African Americans who were supposed to be free could end up doing forced labor for years, often in much worse conditions than they would have faced in prison. The pig law was a big reason why the number of people in Mississippi's prisons shot up so quickly. In 1877, just a year after the law was passed, the prison population jumped from 272 to 1,072, nearly 4 times as many people. This huge increase gave the state and private businesses a steady stream of cheap labor, which they were more than happy to take advantage of. This whole system, fueled by laws like the pig law, was basically a way to keep African Americans in a state of near slavery, even though slavery was supposed to be over. The harsh conditions and the way convicts were treated showed just how deep the racial prejudices ran at the time. It was a clear sign that, even though slavery had officially ended, the fight for real freedom and equality was far from finished. So, after the Civil War, you'd think freedom meant things would get better for African Americans, right? Unfortunately, not so much. In the South, They came up with this convict leasing system that was a new way to keep black people down, even though slavery was supposed to be over. They used laws like the pig law and vagrancy laws to turn this system into a big business. Here's how it worked. If a black person got caught stealing something as small as a pig or just being unemployed, they could end up in jail. But instead of staying in jail, they were leased out to people like plantation owners, railroad builders, and contractors. These convicts were forced to work in horrible conditions, often locked up in cages or makeshift prisons out in the middle of nowhere, far from anyone who might actually care about what was happening to them. The people running these convict camps had total control over the convicts' lives. And because the camps were so isolated, nobody really knew or could do anything about the awful things happening there. It didn't help that a lot of folks at the time thought black people were somehow less human, so they didn't see this system as a big problem. This allowed the convict leasing system to keep going, making lots of money for the people in charge while continuing to exploit African Americans. Now, here's where it gets even more twisted. This system was designed specifically to target black people. Hardly any white folks were sent to these camps, and when they were, it was for really serious crimes. Instead, white convicts usually served their time in regular prisons where things were much safer. The contractors who ran these camps didn't want white and black convicts mixing, so they kept them separate. And if a white convict did end up in the system, they'd often be given a job as a supervisor, bossing around the black convicts. This kept the racial hierarchy intact, making sure that even in this brutal system, white people stayed on top. In short, the convict leasing system was a way to keep African Americans in a state of near slavery, even after slavery was officially abolished. It was a system built on racism, cruelty, and the exploitation of black labor, and it left a deep, painful mark on the history of the South. So, after the Civil War, the South had to find new ways to keep African Americans under control, even though slavery was officially over. They came up with this system called convict leasing, where they used laws to arrest African Americans for really minor stuff and then lease them out to do hard labor. But here's the kicker. The system was set up so that the harshest jobs, like working on plantations or building levees, were given to black convicts. White convicts, on the other hand, usually got easier jobs like supervising or doing paperwork. This wasn't just about who could do the job. It was about keeping the old racial order in place, making sure that white people were still on top, even in this new system. By 1869, there were hundreds of black convicts being leased out to work in brutal conditions, often on the very same plantations where they had been enslaved before. Meanwhile, only a handful of white convicts had to work outside the prison, and even then, they were often in charge of supervising the black convicts or doing less physically demanding work. This setup was no accident. It was designed to make sure that the racial hierarchy from the slavery days stayed intact. Now, things got even worse as the years went on. By 1872, almost all the white convicts were kept safe inside the prison, while the black convicts were the ones out in the fields doing the hardest, most dangerous work. The system didn't just exploit African American labor, it was deadly. Between 1880 and 1885, nearly 500 black convicts died from the brutal conditions, while only 28 white convicts met the same fate. The difference in treatment was staggering and showed just how deeply racist this system was. One particularly horrific incident happened in 1884, when a group of black convicts was sent out to work in Vicksburg. They left the prison in good health, but came back severely injured or disabled. They had been forced to work through the winter without proper clothing, leading to frostbite, and were beaten mercilessly by their overseers. These guys were supposed to be serving time for minor crimes, but instead, they were treated worse than animals, all because the system was built to keep them down and keep the old racial power structures alive. In short, the convict leasing system was a way for the South to continue exploiting African Americans and keeping them in a state of near slavery, even after slavery had officially ended. It was all about maintaining control, making sure that the freedom promised after the Civil War was never fully realized for black people in the South. So, back in 1887, a grand jury in Hinds County decided to check out what was going on in one of the state prisons. What they found was horrifying. They discovered that convicts who had been leased out to work on farms and railroads were being treated so brutally that many of them ended up with incurable diseases. These guys were sent back to the prison hospital in terrible shape. Some had their backs covered in huge scars from repeated beatings, and their skin was literally peeling off from all the abuse they'd been through. The jury saw that some of these convicts were so badly beaten that their skin had peeled off in chunks, and their hands and feet were frostbitten because they'd been forced to work in freezing conditions without proper clothing. It was a nightmare scenario. When these convicts were brought back to the hospital, they were just left to suffer on bare boards with hardly any food to eat. They were so skinny and weak that their bones were practically sticking out through their skin. And to make it even worse, there were live bugs crawling all over them as they lay there in pain. The clothes and blankets these guys had were so filthy and stiff that they were basically useless. The grand jury's report made it clear that the convict leasing system was nothing short of a horror show. These people were being worked to death, beaten, starved, and left to die in the most disgusting and inhumane conditions imaginable. Despite how shocking this was, when the incident was reported in a local newspaper, state officials started to investigate. But then, all of a sudden, they stopped. Why? Because a powerful group, likely those who were making money off the convict leasing system, shut the investigation down. They didn't want the truth getting out, and they definitely didn't want to lose their profits. So the abuses continued, and the system kept going without anyone really doing anything to stop it. This whole situation showed just how messed up and corrupt things were in the South after the Civil War. Even though slavery was supposed to be over, systems like convict leasing were basically just slavery by another name. The way black convicts were treated compared to white convicts was shocking. And the fact that so many black people died in these conditions proves that this system was designed to keep African Americans down, no matter what. The system was set up to exploit them, to make sure they stayed poor, powerless, and in a state of constant suffering, all while pretending it was legal. So, back in the late 1800s, Mississippi had this brutal system where they leased out prisoners, most of whom were African Americans, to private contractors. These contractors, like a guy named McDonald, would work these prisoners to death. Literally. In just 6 months, 20 of the convicts leased to McDonald died because of the horrible conditions they were forced to endure. On top of that, 23 others were sent back to the state prison so sick and injured that many of them died soon after. It was a nightmare, and some prisoners were so desperate to escape that they either ran away or were let go, probably because they were too weak to work anymore. The whole thing was so awful that it eventually led to some changes in the law. But these changes didn't really help the prisoners. They just shifted the control of the system from private contractors to the state. In 1894, Mississippi passed a law that allowed the state to use convicts for free labor on public works like building roads and levees. This might have seemed like a step forward, but it was really just a way to keep exploiting these people under a different name. A guy named J.H. Jones, who saw what was going on, described it as pure greed. The state was still making money off the backs of these convicts, most of whom were African Americans, just like during slavery. Even though the laws had changed, the goal was the same: keep African Americans down and profit from their suffering. The new system was just as bad as the old one. It was still about using people as tools to get work done without caring about their lives or well-being. This whole situation shows how, even after slavery was technically over, the South found new ways to keep African Americans trapped in a cycle of exploitation. They were supposed to be free, but the reality was that they were still being treated like property, forced to work under terrible conditions with no real way out. It's a clear example of how deeply rooted racism and greed were in the society of that time, and how those in power would do anything to keep it that way. After the Civil War, even though slavery was officially over, the South found sneaky ways to keep African Americans trapped in a system that was almost as bad. One of the worst of these systems was convict leasing. Here's how it worked. African Americans, many of whom were just trying to survive in a world that wasn't built for them, would get arrested for minor things, stuff that wouldn't even get a second glance if a white person did it. But because of the way the laws were set up, these minor offenses could land them in prison. Once in prison, things got even worse. Instead of just serving their time, these convicts, most of them African Americans, were leased out to do really tough, dangerous work. We're talking about building railroads, working on farms, and other back-breaking jobs. And the people in charge didn't care about their well-being at all. They just wanted to squeeze as much work out of them as possible. The conditions were so brutal that many of these convicts didn't make it out alive. For example, in South Carolina, almost half of the prisoners working on a railroad project died because the work conditions were so awful. This wasn't just bad luck. It was part of a system that treated these convicts as disposable. The same thing was happening all over the South. In Tennessee, a third of the convicts died in just 2 years. Meanwhile, in northern states where the prisons weren't great, but at least tried to keep people alive, only about 1% of the prisoners died. The South's convict leasing system wasn't just about punishing people for crimes. It was about keeping African Americans down and continuing to exploit their labor, just like during slavery. The laws were set up to make sure that most of the people being leased out were African American, reinforcing the racial inequalities that had been in place for generations. One of the most chilling things came from a warden in South Carolina who admitted that fewer people would have died if they had been considered valuable. But the truth was, in this system, African American lives were seen as cheap and expendable. The whole point was to keep them working until they literally couldn't anymore. This system was all about maintaining control. It was a way for Southern whites to get around the fact that slavery had been abolished, using the legal system to force African Americans back into a life of hard labor and oppression. The disparities in who got arrested, who got leased out, and who survived were no accident. They were the result of a system designed to keep African Americans in their place, even after they were supposed to be free. So, while slavery was officially over, the convict leasing system made sure that the reality for many African Americans wasn't much different. It was a harsh, cruel system that showed just how far some people would go to hold on to power and keep others down. After the Civil War, when slavery was supposed to be over, the South found sneaky ways to keep African Americans under control and working for them. One of the most twisted methods they used was something called the convict leasing system. This system was basically a way to keep black people working for free, just like during slavery, but now under the guise of punishment for crimes. Politicians like George D. Tillman from South Carolina were big supporters of this system. He had some pretty messed up beliefs, claiming that African Americans were naturally inclined to steal and break the rules. Tillman argued that instead of taxpayers paying for prisoners' upkeep, the state should make money off them by leasing them out as laborers. This wasn't just about saving money, it was about finding a way to keep African Americans in a position of servitude. Convict labor became a huge part of the South's economy. In Florida, convicts were put to work in phosphate mines. In places like Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, they were sent to work in coal mines. They were also forced to build railroads across the South, literally laying the tracks for the region's industrial growth after the war. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about getting cheap labor. It was also about maintaining the racial order that existed during slavery. The South used the criminal justice system to keep African Americans in a state of near slavery, justifying it all under the pretense of law and order. The same racial inequalities that existed before the Civil War were kept alive through these practices, ensuring that African Americans remained at the bottom of the social ladder. The conditions for these convicts were brutal. Many of them, especially African Americans, were forced to live in tiny, cramped cages that were less spacious than a small box. They were then put to work building and repairing roads under these awful conditions. By the 1930s, the situation had only gotten worse. African Americans made up the vast majority of the convict population in the South, even though they were a much smaller percentage of the overall population. For example, in Georgia, black people were 37% of the population, but made up 83% of the prisoners. These numbers weren't just a coincidence. They were the result of a system that was deliberately set up to continue exploiting African Americans. The convict leasing system and chain gangs were just new ways to keep black people under control and working for free, all while claiming it was about enforcing the law. The truth is, it was all about maintaining the old social order, where African Americans were kept down and exploited, even after slavery was supposed to be over. So, while the South was rebuilding and expanding its infrastructure, it was doing so on the backs of African Americans who were still being forced to work in terrible conditions. The whole system was rigged to keep things the way they had always been, ensuring that African Americans remained oppressed and exploited long after the Civil War had ended. Even though the Civil War ended in the 1860s and slavery was officially abolished, many Southern states found sneaky ways to keep African Americans under control and working in brutal conditions, all while pretending it was legal. One of the worst ways they did this was through something called the convict leasing system. This system worked like this. African Americans were often arrested for very minor offenses, things that white people wouldn't get in trouble for. Once they were in jail, they were leased out to work on roads, in mines, or on farms, often in conditions that were just as bad, if not worse, than slavery. The state made money off this forced labor, and the people who leased the convicts got free or super cheap labor. It was a win-win for everyone, except of course for the convicts. This wasn't just a short-term problem. Even by the 1930s, decades after slavery was supposed to have ended, African Americans were still being forced into these horrible situations. They were crammed into tiny cages, worked to the bone on chain gangs, and treated like they were still slaves, all under the excuse of punishment for minor crimes. In Georgia, for example, African Americans made up a huge percentage of the prison population, even though they were only a small part of the overall population. This wasn't an accident. It was all part of a system designed to keep them oppressed and working for free. The state governments and private companies didn't want to lose the free labor they had relied on during slavery, so they used the criminal justice system to keep it going. These practices were just one part of a bigger effort to maintain the racial order that existed before the Civil War. Even though slavery was over, the South was determined to keep African Americans in a state of subjugation, working for little to nothing and having very few rights. The convict leasing system, chain gangs, and unfair labor contracts all worked together to make sure that African Americans stayed at the bottom of the social ladder just as they had been during slavery. So while it might seem like the Civil War and the end of slavery should have brought freedom and equality, the reality was much darker. The South found new ways to keep African Americans oppressed, and these practices continued well into the 20th century. This shows just how deeply entrenched racial inequality was, and in many ways still is, in American society. Even after slavery was officially over, the South found new ways to keep African Americans working in harsh, unfair conditions. They used the prison system to continue exploiting black people, making them work for free or very little pay, just like during slavery. This wasn't just about making money. It was about keeping African Americans in a lower social position, making sure they couldn't rise up and challenge the way things were. The Southern prison system was designed to scare and control African Americans. The brutal conditions in the prisons and on chain gangs were meant to keep black people in their place. The fear of being sent to these terrible places stopped many African Americans from pushing for true freedom and equality. The system made sure that even though slavery was officially gone, the same kind of exploitation continued. In a nutshell, the Southern prison system was like slavery with a different name. African Americans were still forced to work in horrible conditions, and the people in power made sure this system seemed legal and normal. This was all part of a bigger effort to keep the old racial hierarchy in place, even though the Civil War was supposed to have ended it. A good example of how deeply this system was ingrained happened in September 1937 in Warren County, Georgia. Cotton farmers were desperate to keep their laborers from leaving to work for other farmers in nearby Glasscock County who were offering better pay. To stop them, Warren County farmers took extreme measures. Some even carried guns and fired shots into the air to scare both their workers and the other farmers. They wanted to make it clear that their workers weren't going anywhere. Even though offering better wages could have been seen as enticement, which was illegal at the time, no one in Glasscock County was charged. This incident shows how, even decades after slavery ended, the South was still relying on intimidation and forced labor to keep African Americans from moving on to better opportunities. Laws like the anti-enticement laws were created to protect the people who were exploiting African American labor. These laws made sure that black workers were stuck in contracts that were almost impossible to escape from, keeping them in a cycle of economic dependence and social subjugation. The 1937 incident in Warren County is just one example of how these practices were deeply rooted and continued to thrive, disguised as legal and necessary for the economy. This situation highlights the ongoing struggle for true freedom and equality that African Americans faced, even when the law said they were free. The South found ways to keep them oppressed, showing that the fight against racial injustice was far from over. Chapter 4: Apprentice Law and Anti-Enticement. In Maryland, there was this law called the Apprentice Law, which seemed like it was meant to keep things orderly, but in reality, it was just another way to keep young African Americans under control after slavery was officially over. Here's how it worked. If a young freedman, or someone who had just been freed from slavery, was found to be without parents or living in poverty, the law allowed local authorities to scoop them up and apprentice them out. That meant these young people, who were supposed to be free, were handed over to work for someone, and most of the time, that someone was their former slave master. Imagine that, you're finally free, but then you're told you have to go back and work for the very person who once owned you. That's what this law did. The court was supposed to make sure that these apprentices were treated fairly, with enough food, clothes, and decent treatment. But let's be honest, the idea of decent treatment back then was pretty twisted. The master could even punish these young people if they thought it was necessary, which wasn't much different from how things were during slavery. These apprenticeships weren't short-term either. Boys were stuck in this situation until they turned 21 and girls until they were 18. And if no one knew how old a kid was, the court would just guess their age, which could mess up their entire future. If one of these young apprentices tried to run away, the master had every right to chase them down and bring them back, as if they were still property. And if anyone tried to help these kids escape by giving them food, clothes, or even just talking to them, they'd be in big trouble too. The law was designed to keep these young people trapped in a life that looked an awful lot like the slavery they were supposed to be free from. In short, Maryland's apprentice law was just a way to keep the old system of control alive, making sure that even after slavery was technically over, African Americans, especially the younger ones, were still stuck in a cycle of forced labor and limited freedom. It was a harsh reminder that just because a law says you're free, it doesn't always mean you actually are. So, in Maryland, there was this apprentice law that seemed to give kids who had just been freed from slavery a chance at a better life. But in reality, it was just another way to keep them trapped. If a master didn't want to keep a kid under their control anymore, they could go to court and cancel the contract. But that didn't mean freedom for the kid. It just meant they'd get handed off to another master, and the cycle of control continued. Even if the master died, the law didn't let the kid go. Instead, the master's widow or family got the first shot at taking the kid back under their control. And there were strict rules too. Masters couldn't take their apprentices out of state, and if they tried, the courts would step in and find a new master within Maryland to take over. The whole system was designed to keep these kids under tight control, no matter what. If a master found a kid hard to handle, like if the kid had a bad attitude or didn't follow orders, the master could take them to court to end the contract. But this wasn't about giving the kid a fresh start. It was just about getting rid of a problem. And the kid would likely end up with another master who might be even tougher. The darkest part of this law was how it targeted the children of former slaves. Even though these kids were supposed to be free, many were still kept by their old masters without any official contract. It was like slavery had never really ended, just changed its name. These kids were trapped in a system that kept them working for their former owners, and the law made sure they stayed in line. Investigations by the Freedmen's Bureau found that this wasn't just happening in Maryland. In other places like Virginia, Alabama, and Kentucky, hundreds of kids were being held as apprentices without any legal contract. And if that wasn't bad enough, new laws were passed in places like South Carolina and Mississippi that made life even harder for freedmen and their children. In South Carolina, for example, freedmen weren't allowed to leave their master's property without permission, which was a lot like the restrictions they faced when they were slaves. And in Mississippi, white people weren't allowed to rent land to freedmen outside of towns, which meant these newly freed people couldn't get the land they needed to build a better life. In short, these laws were all about keeping control over freedmen and their kids, making sure that even though slavery was technically over, the same old power dynamics stayed in place. It was a tough reality for those who had hoped that freedom would bring real change. In South Carolina, they didn't just stop at making tough laws for freedmen. They went a step further and created a whole separate court system just for trying freedmen. This wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping control over people who had just gained their freedom. Across the South, freedmen were blocked from starting businesses or learning trades unless they had special permission. This made it nearly impossible for them to become truly independent. These rules, known as black codes, were basically a way to bring back a version of slavery, just with a new name. Congress soon saw through these laws and realized they were designed to keep freedmen from really being free. Local governments in the South used these laws to keep things the way they were before the Civil War, ensuring that the power remained in the same hands as before. One of the worst parts was how these laws targeted kids. In Mississippi, the apprentice law allowed courts to take children away from their parents if the court decided the parents couldn't take care of them properly. This decision was often unfair and based on the biased idea that freedmen weren't capable of raising their own kids. As a result, many children were taken from their families and placed back with their former masters under the pretense of apprenticeship. The real goal of these laws was to undo the freedom that had been won in the Civil War. By using the courts to take children away and place them with people who had once owned them, the old power structures were maintained. Even though slavery was officially over, these laws made sure that freedmen and their children remained under the control of the same people who had enslaved them. This wasn't just unfair, it was a calculated way to keep the cycle of oppression going. So here's what was happening. If an apprentice, a young person who was supposed to be learning a trade or skill, was taken or held without their employer's permission, the employer could go to court to get them back, almost like you would with stolen property. This shows just how these young people were treated, not as humans with rights, but as things that could be owned and reclaimed. Now, if this apprentice got into trouble and was fined by the court, the employer could pay the fine. But here's the catch. If the employer paid, the apprentice's contract got extended, meaning they had to work even longer. This was a sneaky way for employers to keep these kids working for them for years beyond what was originally agreed. Police officers had to report all kids under 18 who didn't have support or were orphans to the local courts twice a year. Then, the courts would assign these kids to be apprentices. But who got first dibs on these kids? Their former slave masters. Yep, the very people who once owned them could now get them back under this so-called legal apprenticeship system, ensuring the cycle of exploitation continued. These kids, mostly the sons of freedmen, had to stay apprentices until they were 21 if they were boys and until 18 if they were girls. The law even allowed the employers to whip these kids for being disobedient. If the apprentice ran away, it was illegal for anyone to help them, and the law protected the employers who wanted to track down and bring back these runaway kids. In reality, these laws were just a way to keep young freedmen under control, ensuring that they remained in a system that was a lot like slavery, just under a different name. The courts played along, siding with the employers and making sure these kids stayed trapped in this unfair system. Mississippi's apprentice law was designed to keep freedmen in line by targeting their kids. By controlling the children, the state made sure that the parents wouldn't try to move away or look for better opportunities. The freedmen knew that their kids could be used against them, so they were more likely to accept whatever harsh conditions were thrown at them, knowing they couldn't easily fight back or leave without risking their children's well-being. This was a way to keep the whole system of oppression going, even after slavery was supposed to be over. So, here's what was happening. The laws in Mississippi were set up in a way that kept young freedmen, those who were supposed to be free, pretty much stuck in a system that looked a lot like the slavery their parents had endured. The so-called apprentice laws were just a new way to control and exploit these young people under the guise of teaching them a trade or skill. First off, these laws made it nearly impossible for these young people to defend themselves. They weren't allowed to carry weapons of any kind, which meant they were defenseless if they wanted to resist or stand up against the harsh treatment they might face. This rule made sure they couldn't fight back or even protect themselves if they needed to. The laws also made sure these kids were stuck in these apprenticeships until they were 21 if they were boys or 18 if they were girls. This wasn't just about teaching them a job. It was about keeping them working for the same people who had once enslaved their families. The masters had to sign a bond, which was like a contract, promising to give these young people basic needs like food and clothing. But this bond also tied them to whatever new laws came along, making sure the control over these young apprentices never loosened. If an apprentice tried to run away, the law was crystal clear. The master had every right to go after them, catch them, and drag them back. If the apprentice refused to come back willingly, they'd be thrown in jail. And if they couldn't pay to get out of jail, because, let's be real, they probably couldn't, the master was allowed to beat them until they agreed to come back. This law wasn't about helping these kids learn or grow. It was about making sure they stayed under the master's thumb no matter what. And if anyone tried to help an apprentice escape this unfair system, they'd be hit with heavy penalties. If someone tried to feed, clothe, or even hire an apprentice without the master's permission, they'd be in big trouble with the law. The court could punish them severely, using the same harsh methods they used against people who tried to help freedmen get away from bad employers. So, while these laws were dressed up to look like they were about teaching trades and maintaining order, they were really just a way to keep control over these young freedmen. The state made sure that the old power dynamic stayed in place, making sure that the promise of freedom was still out of reach for many. Mississippi's apprentice laws were a thinly veiled effort to reestablish a system of control that bore a striking resemblance to slavery, all while cloaking it in the legitimacy of legal apprenticeship. These laws provided former slaveholders with a legal avenue to continue exploiting the labor of freedmen and their children, making sure that the supposed transition from slavery to freedom was still marred by exploitation and oppression. This legal framework ensured that the promises of freedom were hollow for many, as the oppressive dynamics of the past were carefully preserved under a different name. The Enticement Act made it illegal to lure a worker away from his employer by offering him inducements of any kind. Its purpose, of course, was to restrict the flow and price of labor by forcing plantation owners to stop stealing each other's Negroes. All right, so picture this. We're down in the Mississippi Delta right after the Civil War. The country's trying to pick up the pieces, but for a lot of folks, especially black families, life is still brutally tough. Take Viney, for example, a mother who's trying to take care of her starving kids. They've got nothing to eat, and in a moment of desperation, she steals a pig from a guy named Wilmer Shields, who owns the plantation where they live. Now, this pig wasn't just any pig. It was a 40-pounder, enough to feed her kids and maybe even stretch out for a little while longer. But here's the catch. Stealing that pig wasn't just a crime. It was a huge risk. In the days before the Civil War, if a slave stole something, the plantation master would likely handle it himself, often with a brutal whipping. But things have changed now. Instead of handling it himself, Shields calls in the sheriff from Natchez to deal with Viney. The new legal system in the South might have been different from the old plantation rules, but in a lot of ways it was just as bad, maybe even worse. Now, instead of a whipping, Viney faced something much more permanent: chains and hard labor. The justice system had become another tool to keep black people in line, transforming minor crimes into reasons to send people to prison camps where they'd work in conditions not much better than slavery. This was all part of a bigger plan by the former Confederate states. They were desperate to keep control over the newly freed black population, especially their labor. So they came up with a bunch of laws to make sure black people stayed where they were, working hard and not causing any trouble. These were called the Black Codes, and they were specifically designed to keep black people down. One of the nastiest tricks in this legal toolbox was something called enticement laws. These laws made it illegal for a black worker to switch jobs or even try to leave their current job. If a freedman wanted to work somewhere else, he could get in big trouble just for trying. The law made it nearly impossible for black workers to improve their situation. If they were stuck with a bad overseer, they were just that, stuck. Over time, these laws didn't just stick around, they got worse. By the 1920s, states like Alabama and Arkansas were cracking down even harder. They made it a crime to even try to hire a worker who was already employed somewhere else, and the penalties for breaking these laws kept getting harsher. Mississippi even had to tweak its laws to keep up with court decisions, making sure they could still nail anyone who didn't play by the rules. And North Carolina, they passed a bunch of enticement laws, especially in areas where black tenants and croppers were common, making it nearly impossible for these workers to escape the cycle of poverty and exploitation. So, what does this all mean? Even though slavery was technically over, the South found ways to keep the same old system going, just under a new name. Through these laws, they managed to keep black people tied to the land and labor that had defined their lives during slavery, making freedom feel like an unreachable dream for many. All right, so here's the deal. After the Civil War, when slavery was officially over, Southern states came up with a bunch of sneaky laws to keep things pretty much the same as before. These laws were designed to make sure that black workers, who were supposed to be free, couldn't just up and leave their jobs or find better opportunities elsewhere. One of these tricks was called the enticement law. This law was like a trap for anyone who tried to hire a worker who was already employed. Imagine you're a black worker stuck in a really bad job, and someone comes along offering you a better deal. Well, if you took that offer, both you and the new employer could get into serious legal trouble. The whole point was to keep you tied to your current job, no matter how awful it was. But it didn't stop there. Another law, called the Immigrant Agent Statute, slapped huge fees on anyone who made a living helping workers move from one state to another. This meant that even if you heard about better opportunities in another state, it would be nearly impossible to get there because the people who could help you were being pushed out of business. All these laws together created a huge, invisible web that kept black workers stuck in the same old system. It was like they were free in name only, still under control, still exploited, still held back by rules that were just slavery with a different name. Take the case of Drayton Bates in 1918. Bates, a black man from North Carolina, went to South Carolina to recruit some farmhands for his boss. He barely got 2 guys interested, but it didn't matter. The authorities jumped on him for breaking the immigrant agent law, which basically said it was illegal to help people leave the state for work. The South Carolina Supreme Court didn't care that he wasn't a professional recruiter. They threw the book at him anyway. This wasn't just about the law, it was about keeping the old power dynamics alive, making sure black workers stayed exactly where the system wanted them. Then there was Moses Chambers in Georgia. He was just talking to another freedman about a better paying job in Tennessee when he got arrested. They were ready to nail him under the same kinds of laws, but this time, the high court in Georgia actually gave him a break, saying there was doubt about whether he was really acting as a labor agent. In the end, they let him go, seeing him as just a guy trying to share a good opportunity with a friend. Chambers' case was a rare win in a system designed to crush any bit of independence black workers tried to find. The whole setup was rooted in an old school mentality where white people thought they still had the right to control black labor. The same attitude that ruled during slavery, where a master controlled every move a slave made, was still hanging around. Even after emancipation, many white folks reacted to the idea of black workers leaving or finding something better, like someone was stealing their property. So while the laws had changed on paper, the reality on the ground for many black workers wasn't all that different from what it had been before the war. They were still trapped, still fighting to truly break free from a system determined to keep them in their place. All right, so let's talk about how the South, even after the Civil War, found ways to keep black workers tied down and under control. Basically, the people in charge didn't want freedmen, former slaves, to have any real freedom. They didn't want them moving around, finding better jobs, or improving their lives. That was seen as a threat to the old way of doing things. So they came up with all these tricky laws. Some were about making sure black workers couldn't just up and leave their jobs for something better. If a freedman tried to get a new job, or if another employer tried to hire them, they could both get into big trouble. The idea was to keep black workers stuck in low-paying, hard labor, right where the powerful folks wanted them. And it wasn't just about controlling the workers themselves. They also made laws to stop other white employers from hiring black workers away from their current bosses. The penalties were pretty steep, heavy fines, and other punishments. The goal was to lock down the labor force, making sure things stayed the same as they had been before slavery was abolished. This was all about keeping black people economically dependent and at the bottom of the social ladder. Now, let's talk about sharecropping. After the Civil War, the South was in bad shape. The rich landowners had a ton of land but not much money to pay workers, so they came up with this system called sharecropping. This wasn't a new idea. It had been used in places like colonial Africa, Scotland, and Ireland long before it showed up in the U.S. Under sharecropping, freedmen would work a piece of land in exchange for a share of the crop. But here's the catch. The landowner set up the system so that the workers never really got ahead. They were often stuck in debt, having to borrow supplies from the landowner at high interest rates. By the time the crop was harvested, the workers owed so much that they had to stay and work another season just to try to pay it off. In other words, sharecropping was just another way to keep black workers in a position where they couldn't get ahead, much like slavery, but with a different name. The landowners got their crops grown without having to pay real wages, and the workers were kept poor and tied to the land. So, even though slavery was officially over, these laws and systems like sharecropping were designed to make sure that black people stayed in the same place they'd always been, working hard for little to nothing, with almost no chance of real freedom or progress. All right, so picture this. You've got a bunch of freedmen, people who had just been emancipated after the Civil War, ready to work, but they don't have land, tools, or money to really make a living on their own. These guys don't want to go back to anything that even remotely looks like slavery because, they just got free. But they're stuck in a tough situation, and what does the South do? They introduce sharecropping, which sounds like freedom, but is really just another trap. Here's how it worked. Sharecroppers didn't own the land, tools, or livestock they needed to farm. They just worked someone else's land, mostly growing cash crops like cotton, and then had to give a big chunk of what they grew to the landowner. It's like doing all the work and only getting a little bit of the reward. Meanwhile, the landowners and merchants were making most of the money, leaving the sharecroppers stuck in a never-ending cycle of hard work and debt. Now, there was another group called tenant farmers who owned some of their own stuff, like cattle or farming tools, but even they weren't fully free from the system. The whole setup was designed to benefit the landowners and keep black farmers tied down to the land, even though slavery had supposedly ended. But it didn't stop there. The South also had these things called pig laws and vagrancy laws, which were pretty much designed to get freedmen thrown into jail for the smallest of reasons. Once they were in jail, they'd be forced to work for free again, just like they did during slavery. So, yeah, it was freedom on paper, but not so much in real life. And let's talk about the apprentice laws. If you were a young freedman, you could be put into an apprenticeship, which sounds like learning a trade, but was really just another way to make you work for someone else without getting much out of it. The laws even made sure that freedmen couldn't leave their jobs easily, thanks to these anti-enticement rules, which kept workers from getting better opportunities. So, basically, after the Civil War, white landowners in the South were angry. They'd lost their slaves, and instead of accepting that, they created new systems to keep black people working for them under different names. Sharecropping, convict leasing, and apprentice laws were all just part of the plan to make sure the racial hierarchy stayed the same. Even though slavery was technically over, black people were still trapped in an unfair system, with little control over their own lives and futures. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. Chapter 5, A Southern Sentiment. Alright, so here's the deal. Even though slavery was officially abolished after the Civil War, the reality for many black people in the South didn't change much. In 1898, the Supreme Court ruled in the Williamson, Mississippi case that it was perfectly okay for Mississippi to set up all sorts of rules that made it almost impossible for black citizens to vote. This decision basically gave a green light to other southern states, who jumped at the chance to keep black people out of the voting booth and out of power. Mississippi was right there, leading the charge to keep black people in a tough spot. Even though the 13th Amendment said slavery was over, the truth is, many freedmen were still living in conditions that looked a whole lot like slavery. They were being forced to work for free, whipped if they didn't comply, and treated like they were still property instead of citizens. Now, while historians have talked a lot about things like peonage, where people were forced to work to pay off debts, tenant farming, sharecropping, and the crop lien system, they haven't always connected the dots to show how these practices were all part of a bigger system. This system was set up to keep black people working hard for little or no pay, just like in the days of slavery. The story of emancipation, when slavery was supposed to end, is often told like it was a great victory, but for many, it was just the beginning of a new kind of struggle. They were still trapped in a world that didn't really see them as free or equal. The black codes were laws specifically designed to keep black people in their place, which meant working for white people under conditions that weren't much better than slavery. These laws made it legal to force black people to work, and they also made it easy for local governments and private citizens to take advantage of black labor. Even if there wasn't a specific law forcing them to work, the customs and beliefs of the time made it clear that black people were expected to keep working for white folks, no questions asked. Right after Reconstruction, these black codes were super important in making sure that the old system of forced labor didn't really go away. Over time, they got even stronger and more embedded in Southern society. This whole setup was pretty much left unchecked until around 1907, when people started to notice just how bad things were. By then, the system was so locked in that it was almost like slavery had never ended. The black codes weren't just about keeping black people working. They were about making sure that white people stayed in control, both economically and socially, long after the Civil War was over. So, while it looked like things had changed on the surface, underneath, it was a different story. The South found new ways to keep black people down, and the fight for real freedom and equality was still far from over. After the Civil War, things were supposed to change for the newly freed slaves, but in the South, they didn't really get the freedom they were promised. Many white Southerners still saw black people as inferior and believed they should stay under white control. This thinking led to the creation of the Black Codes, a set of laws aimed at keeping black people down. These codes were harsh and unfair, making it almost impossible for freedmen to truly live as free citizens. When a freedman was accused of breaking one of these codes, like not having a job or a place to live, he was quickly taken to court. But the courts weren't fair. They were stacked against him. Almost every time, he was found guilty and sentenced to prison. Once in prison, these black men were forced to work in terrible conditions, like mining, building railways, or working on roads. They were watched over by guards with rifles, making sure they kept working no matter how tough it got. This system, called convict leasing, was like slavery all over again, just with a different name. The Southern states didn't want to let go of their control over black labor, even after slavery was officially abolished. They came up with the black codes as a way to keep freedmen in a state that was pretty close to slavery. These laws were designed to limit every part of a black person's life, where they could go, what kind of work they could do, and even their basic rights. The goal was to make sure that, even though they were no longer slaves, they didn't get the full benefits of freedom. Take Louisiana, for example. The state passed laws that made it nearly impossible for freedmen to live freely. One law said that every freed black man and woman had to find a home and prove they could support themselves within 20 days. If they couldn't, they were arrested and then sold off at public auction to work for the rest of the year. This was a cruel way of continuing the old system of slavery, just dressed up in new clothes. By making survival itself a crime, Louisiana was essentially re-enslaving freedmen, showing that the South wasn't ready to truly let go of the past. In short, even after the end of slavery, the South found ways to keep black people oppressed. The black codes and other laws made sure that the freedoms promised by the 13th Amendment were out of reach for many freedmen, keeping them trapped in a system that looked a lot like the one they had supposedly escaped. After the Civil War, the Southern states didn't just let go of the old ways. They created the Black Codes, a set of laws designed to keep black people under control, even though slavery was supposed to be over. These laws were so restrictive that they made the freedom granted by the 13th Amendment almost meaningless for black Americans. When these laws were looked at by Congress, especially during the slaughterhouse cases, Justice Miller made it clear that without federal protection, black people in the South would be living under conditions almost worse than slavery. The Black Codes were meant to strip away their rights and keep them oppressed, ensuring that any idea of freedom was just that, an idea with no real substance behind it. A political figure, James Blaine, put it bluntly: these laws took away the true meaning of freedom for black people, turning their rights into empty promises. The Black Codes weren't just rules, they were tools of racial control, making sure that the South could maintain its old power structures under the guise of law and order. In South Carolina, for instance, the Black Codes infiltrated every part of a black person's life, making it nearly impossible for them to achieve financial independence or security. Despite these harsh conditions, the freedmen of South Carolina kept fighting for a better life, hoping that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 would bring real change. But in reality, the Black Codes across the South kept all freedmen locked in a system of racial oppression, cutting off their opportunities and freedoms. South Carolina's laws were particularly brutal. They made it illegal for any black person to hold a job outside of being a servant or working in agriculture. This meant they couldn't be artists, tradesmen, business owners, or mechanics, jobs that were traditionally held by white people. On top of that, if a black person working in farming wanted to sell any of their products, they needed written permission from their employer. This kept them tied to the land and to their employers, ensuring they had very little chance of gaining true economic independence. In simple terms, the Black Codes were designed to keep black people down, ensuring that their so-called freedom was anything but free. These laws were part of a larger system that aimed to keep the racial hierarchies of the Old South firmly in place, despite the changes that were supposed to come after the Civil War. These laws in South Carolina were all about keeping black people economically dependent and making sure they stayed in a lower position in society. By limiting the jobs they could take and controlling how they could do business, the state was trying to keep the old racial hierarchy intact, the same system that existed before the Civil War. Even though slavery was officially over, these laws made sure that black people were still stuck in tough conditions, almost like they were never really freed at all. These laws went even further, making it impossible for black people to get a license to sell goods like crops or other products. This wasn't just about business, it was about power. Southern white people had deep fears and prejudices, believing that black people were somehow less capable and not fit to take care of themselves. After losing the Civil War, these white Southerners used the Black Codes to legally keep black people in a place of dependency and inferiority. When Reconstruction began to take shape, South Carolina didn't waste any time putting strict labor laws in place. These laws were designed to control black workers by making it a crime if they didn't do their jobs as expected or if they tried to push back against unfair treatment. If a black worker didn't stick to the conditions of their labor contract, they could be fined or thrown in jail. This meant that contracts were less about agreements between equals and more about keeping black workers trapped in bad conditions. The law made sure that if a black person tried to improve their situation or resist being exploited, they could be punished by law. In 1907, things took a turn when two different courts declared that part of South Carolina's criminal code was unconstitutional. They recognized that it basically forced black workers into a kind of peonage, or debt slavery. Both the state Supreme Court and the federal district court agreed that the law had been specifically designed to control black labor. But instead of backing down, South Carolina, like many other southern states, just went ahead and revised the law, bringing it back under a new name. This move showed just how determined these states were to keep black people under control, no matter what the court said. So, even though the laws had to change on paper, the reality for black people in the South didn't improve much. The goal of these laws, keeping black people in a position of weakness and dependence, remained the same, even if the laws themselves had to be rewritten. The fight for true freedom and equality was far from over, and the South was doing everything it could to hold on to its old ways of thinking. The folks in charge in South Carolina were really determined to keep a system going that was basically just another version of slavery. Between 1907 and 1918, they passed a bunch of new laws that were all about keeping black people stuck in low-paying, unfair jobs. These laws made it illegal for black workers to break their work contracts, which meant that if they tried to quit or find a better job, they could be punished. This was a way to make sure that black people stayed in a situation where they had to work for very little money and had very few rights. South Carolina wasn't the only place doing this. Other southern states were playing the same game. Every time someone challenged these unfair laws in court, the state would just tweak the rules a little bit so they could keep doing what they were doing. The goal was to keep black people from really enjoying the freedom that was supposed to come with the end of slavery. Instead of being truly free, many black people found themselves trapped in a cycle of working hard for almost nothing, with no real way to get ahead. The black codes were like a big, sneaky plan to keep things looking fair on the surface, while underneath, they were all about keeping black people down. These laws gave white people in the South the power to control black workers however they wanted. They used legal contracts to make it look like everything was above board, but in reality, these contracts were just another way to force black people into a life of hard work with little freedom. In this system, some black people might have had a little bit of freedom to move around or choose their jobs, but it was all very limited. The system was set up so that white people could keep exploiting black labor while pretending that the South had moved on from slavery. This way, they could keep the old ways of controlling black people alive, just in a new form. Before 1969, some black people started moving away from the Southeast to the Southwest, and later, many began heading up north. They did this to find better jobs and escape the harsh conditions in the South. But when the southern states felt like they were losing too many workers, they cracked down hard. They passed even tougher laws to keep black people from leaving. And if anyone tried to move away, they could end up in jail. Once in jail, they were often forced into labor, pretty much like being enslaved all over again. So, even though slavery was supposed to be over, the people in charge found new ways to keep black people under their control, using the law to make it all look legitimate. It was a system that let the South keep its old, unfair ways while pretending to offer freedom. The black codes in the South were like a well-oiled machine that worked with the courts and police to trap black people in a never-ending cycle of unfair treatment. Imagine going from being a slave to being told you're free, only to find out that you're still stuck doing hard labor for little or no pay. That wasn't an accident. It was actually the goal of these laws, like the ones that made it illegal to leave your job or try to find better work. Around 1916 and 1917, when many black people started to leave the South, looking for better lives elsewhere, the white folks in charge did everything they could to stop them, even using violence. It wasn't just about keeping workers around, it was about keeping a system going that was built on making sure black people stayed in a low position in society. In fact, some people from that time, like a writer in 1938, talked about how slavery hadn't really gone away. It had just changed its name. This shows that the struggle for true freedom and independence for black Americans was still very real, even decades after the Civil War. When over 300,000 slaves were freed, Mississippi had a problem. What to do with all these newly free black people? They didn't see this as a moment to celebrate freedom. They saw it as a challenge to their way of life. Even though at first they were a bit inconsistent with enforcing laws on free black people, by the 1900s they were using these laws, especially vagrancy laws, to keep black people under control. These vagrancy laws were really harsh and were used to make sure black people couldn't just go wherever they wanted or find better jobs. If you were black and didn't have a job, or if you were just moving around, you could be arrested, fined, or forced into labor. This wasn't just about keeping order, it was about making sure that black people were still working for white people, just like they were before slavery ended. So, while it might have seemed like there was a free job market where people could choose their work, that wasn't really the case. The laws were set up to make sure that black labor was still controlled and exploited, keeping the old system alive in a new form. So, after the Civil War, Southern states, including Mississippi, came up with new ways to keep black people under control, even though they were supposed to be free. One way they did this was by putting a tax on every free black person between 18 and 60 years old. If someone couldn't pay this tax, they were labeled a vagrant, which basically meant they could be arrested for not having a job or home. Once arrested, they'd be forced to work to pay off the tax and the cost of their arrest. This turned poverty into a crime and was a way to force black people back into hard labor. If a black person was working under a labor contract and tried to quit because of poor conditions, they would lose any money they had earned. This rule made it nearly impossible to leave a bad job, trapping people in terrible situations. And if someone did manage to leave, the police were told to hunt them down, bring them back, and charge them and their employer money for the trouble. This added more debt to the freed person, keeping them stuck in a cycle of forced labor and poverty. All these laws worked together to keep black people dependent on their employers and stop them from truly being free. The legal system wasn't just about keeping order. It was designed to keep the old ways of slavery alive, even after slavery was supposed to be over. The southern states, especially Mississippi, also brought back old laws from the days of slavery, tweaking them to keep black people in a state of near slavery. One of the worst laws was the vagrancy law, which was enforced mostly against black people. These laws required them to have a home and job within a certain time, or they'd be arrested. This was just another way to take away their freedom, making sure they stayed in a system where white people were on top. The black codes in Mississippi were part of this plan. In 1865, the state made it illegal for black people to ride in the same first-class train cars as white people. This wasn't just about where people could sit. It was about making sure the old racist rules stayed in place. If anyone broke this rule, they could be fined a lot of money, which was just another way to reinforce segregation and keep black people from experiencing true equality. So, back in the day, Mississippi had some pretty messed up laws aimed at keeping black folks down, even though they were supposed to be free. If a black person couldn't pay a fine, they wouldn't just go to jail. They'd be put to work, basically forced to work off their debt, while the state or local authorities made money off their labor. This was especially true during the harvest season, when farmers needed people to work in the cotton fields. The cops would ramp up their searches for so-called vagrants, people they claimed were just hanging around doing nothing, and arrest them. These folks, mostly black, would be convicted and then forced to work in the fields, all to help out the white farmers who needed cheap labor. But this wasn't just about punishing people for small crimes. It was a way to keep black folks stuck in a system that looked a lot like the slavery they were supposed to have escaped. The courts even made certain minor crimes into felonies just because they thought black people committed them more often. This wasn't just about keeping black and white people separate. It was about trying to recreate the conditions of slavery by using the law to control black people's lives and keep them working for the benefit of white folks. In the South, white farmers and politicians didn't just see black people as neighbors. They saw them as laborers who needed to be controlled to keep the economy running smoothly. They believed that if black people were allowed to vote or have a say in politics, they wouldn't be as easy to control, which would mess up the whole system that the South relied on. So, keeping black people from voting wasn't just about racism. It was also about making sure that they stayed stuck in low-paying, hard labor jobs where their work could be exploited without them having any power to change things. The idea was that as long as black people had no political power, they'd have no choice but to keep working under the tough conditions set by those in charge. So, on November 29, 1865, Mississippi came up with some new rules that were pretty much designed to keep black folks down, even after they were supposed to be free. First off, they made it illegal for any black person to have a gun unless they were in the military or had special permission from the local authorities. This wasn't just about safety. It was a way to make sure that black people couldn't defend themselves or stand up for their rights. If someone broke this rule, they'd have to pay a fine and could lose their weapons, which meant they were left defenseless. Next, the law targeted black religious leaders. If you were a black person trying to be a minister without the official okay from a recognized church, you could end up in jail. And if you got caught doing something the law didn't like, you could be locked up for up to 30 days. These rules were meant to weaken the community and keep black people from organizing or finding strength in their faith during this tough time. Then there was another law that made it a crime for white people to help black folks by giving them a weapon. If a white person was caught selling or giving a gun or ammo to a black person, they'd face a hefty fine and could also end up in jail for a month. This was all about keeping black people powerless and making sure they couldn't defend themselves if things got rough. And here's where it gets really bad. If a black person was found guilty of a minor crime and couldn't pay the fine, they'd be put up for auction, where the highest bidder could pay the fine and essentially hire them to work off the debt. This was just a sneaky way to keep slavery going, even though it was supposed to be over. They made sure that black people, who were supposedly free, were still treated like property, having to work for white folks to pay off their debts. In short, these laws were Mississippi's way of trying to keep black people under control, making sure they couldn't truly be free or have any real power. It was all about maintaining the old order and making sure the so-called freedom they had was just an illusion. Conclusion. So, back in the day, the whole system of slavery in the South was set up for one big, nasty purpose: to make sure that white folks could use black people for hard labor without paying a dime. The whole thing was justified by this ugly belief that black people weren't as human as white folks, which made it easier for those in power to treat them like they didn't deserve the same rights or respect. It was like they locked black people in two kinds of chains, one that forced them to work and another that denied them their humanity and citizenship. When the Civil War ended on May 9, 1865, 4 million black people were supposed to be free from the nightmare of slavery. But instead of true freedom, they got hit with something called the Black Codes. These were laws designed to keep black people in a state of near slavery, making sure they couldn't move around freely, get decent jobs, or enjoy the rights that freedom was supposed to bring. The Black Code stuck around for over 30 years, from 1865 to 1896, proving that just because the war ended didn't mean the fight for freedom was over. The South used these laws to maintain the old racial and economic order, keeping black people down and ensuring they remained under control. So even though many people thought slavery ended when the Civil War did, the reality was much more complicated and painful. Slavery didn't just disappear. It changed its shape and continued in different forms, like through these oppressive black codes, keeping black people trapped in a new kind of bondage. In short, the end of the Civil War didn't really mean freedom for African Americans. It was more like a shift from one type of oppression to another, and the fight against systemic racism and exploitation carried on long after 1865. The so-called end of slavery was just the start of a new struggle, one that would continue for generations. After the Civil War, the South was in a bad spot. No money, a wrecked economy, and lots of rebuilding to do. To get things back on track, they came up with some pretty harsh laws that targeted black people. These laws made it super easy to arrest black folks for almost anything. And once they were in the system, they were forced into labor, like building railroads or fixing levees. Basically, it was like they were still slaves, even though slavery was supposed to be over. The people in charge, like police officers, judges, and sheriffs, were really into these laws because they got free labor out of it. They'd arrest black men and women left and right just to keep this cheap labor going. It wasn't about keeping order, it was about making sure the South had workers to rebuild everything without having to pay them. So, even though the Civil War was supposed to end slavery, these laws kept the same old system going, just under a different name. Then, when the Black Codes started to lose their grip around 1896, the South didn't just give up. Nope, they came up with something even more intense: Jim Crow laws. These laws made segregation official, keeping black people and white people separate in almost every part of life, from schools to restaurants. The big twist? The Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, said this was okay, as long as everything was separate but equal. Spoiler, things were never equal. Jim Crow laws were all about making sure black people stayed in a second-class status without the rights that white folks had. They couldn't vote easily, they got worse jobs and schools, and they were pushed to the edges of society. The laws weren't just rules, they were a way to keep the old racist ideas alive and well, even when the country was supposed to be moving forward. So, while it looked like things were getting better on the surface, underneath, the same old problems were still running the show. just dressed up in new clothes. After the Civil War, things were supposed to change for the better for black people in the South. They were promised freedom and equality, but that promise was quickly broken. The South came up with a bunch of new laws called the Black Codes, which were basically a way to keep black people under control and make sure they couldn't really enjoy their freedom. Then, things got even worse with Jim Crow laws, which were like a supercharged version of the Black Codes. These laws made it illegal for black and white people to do almost anything together. Ride the same bus, go to the same schools, even drink from the same water fountains. Black people were treated as second-class citizens, and they were kept out of good jobs, nice neighborhoods, and even the right to vote. Even though the Constitution was supposed to protect everyone's rights, those protections got rolled back when President Rutherford B. Hayes took office in 1877. He basically ended the efforts to make sure black people were treated fairly in the South, and that allowed white supremacy to take hold again. In 1896, the Supreme Court made things even worse with a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, where they said it was okay to have separate but equal facilities for black and white people. But in reality, things were never equal. Black people got the short end of the stick every time. Under Jim Crow laws, black people lived in constant fear. Something as simple as drinking from the wrong water fountain could get you hurt or even killed. The worst part of it all was lynching, where black people were brutally murdered by mobs, often with no punishment for the killers. This wasn't just violence. It was a way to scare black people into staying in their place. The Jim Crow laws and the violence that came with them stuck around for a long time. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that these laws were finally thrown out. But by then, a lot of damage had already been done. The fight for real freedom and equality had been a long and painful one, and the effects of those years still linger today. So after the Civil War, you'd think things would get better for black people, right? Well, not so fast. The South wasn't ready to let go of its old ways, so they came up with these Black Codes. These were basically sneaky ways to keep black folks in a situation that was almost like slavery, just with a different name. They were still being whipped, beaten, and forced to work under horrible conditions. It was like a terrible game where the rules were rigged to make sure black people couldn't really enjoy their freedom. But the story didn't end there. Fast forward almost a century, and you get the Jim Crow laws. These were even worse in some ways because they made sure black people were treated like second-class citizens. Everything was separate. Schools, bathrooms, water fountains, you name it. It was all about keeping people apart and making sure black folks stayed at the bottom. Even though the Constitution said everyone was supposed to be equal, Jim Crow laws were like a big "not really" sign. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that things really started to change. This law finally knocked down Jim Crow and said enough is enough. It was like the grand finale of a long, painful struggle that started right after the Civil War. Finally, black people were recognized as full citizens with the rights they were promised way back when. To sum it up, imagine slavery in the U.S. like a pair of heavy iron chains. One chain was all about forced labor, making people work against their will. The Civil War started to break that chain. But the other chain, the one that denied black people their humanity and citizenship, stuck around for a long time. That chain didn't really start to crack until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came along, finally setting things on a path toward real freedom and equality. And that, my friend, is how the long, tough journey to true freedom and citizenship finally started moving in the right direction. So, picture this. It wasn't until July 2nd, 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, that the super strong grip of Jim Crow was finally broken. This law was a huge deal because it officially ended the legalized racism that had been holding back black Americans for so long. It was like finally getting rid of the last chains of slavery, both the forced labor and the denial of basic human rights that had kept African Americans down for centuries. This moment marked the true end of the institution of slavery in the U.S., even though it had been abolished on paper a long time ago. It was like closing a really tough and painful chapter in history and starting fresh. Now, there's this famous guy, Frederick Douglass, who was a big deal in the fight against slavery. He once pointed out something really awful that had been said by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney in a court case called Dred Scott back in 1857. Taney claimed that black people weren't meant to have any rights that white people had to respect. Yeah, he actually said that. This idea was pretty much the rule of the land back then, and it gave white people the green light to do terrible things to black folks. like shooting, hanging, burning, whipping, or even starving them, without getting in trouble for it. Taney's words weren't just a legal ruling, they were a reflection of how messed up the thinking was at the time. Douglass talked about this to show just how brutal life was for black people in America, where even the highest court seemed to agree that their lives didn't matter. The Dred Scott decision was a harsh reminder that in the eyes of the law back then, black lives were seen as worthless. This was one of the reasons why people like Douglass fought so hard to change things. The black codes and Jim Crow laws were like the evil grandkids of the old slave laws. They were made to keep black people in a state of oppression, just like during slavery. These laws were designed to make sure that African Americans couldn't enjoy real freedom, and instead they were kept under the control of white society. It was like slavery all over again, just dressed up in different clothes. The harsh reality was that the children of former slaves were born into a world where they were still treated as property, just like their ancestors had been. This cycle of oppression was meant to keep going, generation after generation, making it really hard for black Americans to ever truly break free. And there you have it, a not so fun but important story about how the fight for true freedom and equality in America took a long, long time and faced a whole lot of resistance along the way. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a turning point that finally started to change things for the better. So after slavery was technically over, the South came up with all these sneaky rules to keep black folks down. First off, they weren't allowed to carry any weapons, which meant they couldn't defend themselves. No surprise here, the people in charge didn't want anyone fighting back. And get this, they weren't even allowed to get together in groups, not during the day or at night. Why? Because the powers that be were super scared of any sort of organized resistance. They also made it so black folks couldn't sell anything they grew or made unless they got the okay from their old bosses. Yep, that's right. They were still trying to keep them economically stuck. But wait, there's more. Black people were shut out from any meaningful legal or civic participation. They couldn't be witnesses or experts in court, and if a white person did them wrong, they couldn't even testify against them. Talk about a rigged system. These laws were just another way to keep the old, ugly system of slavery going. But with a shiny new legal coat of paint, they made sure that black folks stayed second-class citizens with no real way to fight back. So, even though the law said they were free, these rules pretty much put them right back where they started. It was like they were living in a giant, unfair game where the deck was always stacked against them. The black codes and everything that came after were just ways to keep things the same as they were during slavery. Same bad rules, just a different name. They were stuck in a cycle of forced labor, working on farms where they couldn't even sell their own crops without their bosses say so. And don't even think about them trying to get justice in court, because that door was slammed shut. In the end, these laws made sure that the struggle was far from over, trapping black folks in a cycle of oppression that took generations to start breaking free from. So here's the deal. After the Civil War, when slavery was supposed to be over, the folks in charge just found a sneaky way to keep the same old bad stuff going. They came up with these things called the Black Codes, which were pretty much a remix of slavery with a fancy new name. Even though black people were technically free, these laws made sure they weren't really free at all. Imagine thinking you're finally getting out of a really bad situation only to find out that nothing's really changed. The Black Codes were like that, just a different version of the same unfair rules. These rules made sure that black folks couldn't really live their lives the way they wanted. They couldn't work where they wanted, live where they wanted, or even protect themselves properly. It was like having one of those free samples at the grocery store. Sure, it's free, but it's just a tiny taste, not the real thing. The impact of these laws wasn't just something that stayed in the South either. It was like a bad smell that spread everywhere, hanging around for a long time. Even as late as the mid-20th century, the shadow of these old rules was still messing things up for black folks, not just in the South, but in the North too. It's like when you think you've cleaned something up, but the stain just won't go away. It keeps reminding you that it's still there. So yeah, these black codes were basically the same old slavery, just dressed up in a different outfit. They made sure that African Americans couldn't really get ahead, no matter how hard they tried. It was a rigged game from the start, and breaking free from it was way harder than it should have been. Hey there, reader. First off, a big sloppy thank you for cracking open this book and sticking with it. Seriously, it's awesome that you took the time to dive into the stories and history packed into these pages. My biggest hope is that something in here made you think, maybe even fired you up a bit and helped you get a better grip on the history of the dark legacy of Southern Black codes. Now, here's the deal. This book is not just some dusty old collection of words. Nope, it's part of something way bigger. I want you to own it, make it your own, and help me spread the word. If you got a sec, leaving a review on Amazon would be super cool. It helps other people find these stories, but don't stop there. Pass this book around. Share it with your friends, family, and anyone who loves a good story. Together, we can make sure the history of the dark legacy of Southern Black codes isn't just some forgotten footnote. And guess what? This isn't the end of the road. I've got more stories coming your way. Yep, more books are in the pipeline, diving into more of the rich and often overlooked history that shaped our world. Plus, I'm cooking up a documentary about the Freedmen's Village. How cool is that? We're taking this story to the screen, baby. So, thanks for hanging out with me on this wild ride. Let's keep this train rolling and make sure these stories get the spotlight they deserve. Catch you later. Dr. Gavin Harrell. Announcement. Hey listeners, get ready to test your knowledge with a 20-question quiz based on the dark legacy of Southern Black codes. Young Reader Edition. I'll read out each question and then I'll give you the correct answer. We'll keep things lively with some cool feedback for your choices. Let's see how much you know about Black codes, Jim Crow laws, and all the highlights from this important history. Ready? Let's go. Question 1. What was the primary purpose of the Black codes? A. To help freedmen find jobs. B. To restrict the freedoms of African Americans. C. To promote equal rights. D. To encourage African Americans to vote. Answer. B. To restrict the freedoms of African Americans. If you pick B, you're super because you're spot on. If you chose something else, that was a wonky choice, but hey, nice try. Question 2. What did vagrancy laws allow Southern states to do? A. Provide free housing for freedmen. B. Offer education to African Americans. C. Arrest and force unemployed African Americans into labor. D. Grant land to freedmen. Answer. C. Arrest and force unemployed African Americans into labor. If you chose C, you're on fire because that's absolutely correct. If you picked something else, that was a bit off, but keep at it. Question 3. The pig laws were created to A. Encourage farming. B. Protect the environment. C. Support animal rights. D. Penalize African Americans for minor crimes. Answer. D. Penalize African Americans for minor crimes. If you went with D, you're crushing it because you got it right. If you chose another answer, that was a bit out there, but keep trying. Question 4. What was the effect of the Dred Scott decision of 1857? A. It declared that African Americans were full citizens. B. It stated that African Americans had no rights that white people were bound to respect. C. It granted voting rights to African Americans. D. It abolished slavery in the southern states. Answer. B. It stated that African Americans had no rights that white people were bound to respect. If you picked B, you're a history champ because that's right. If you picked something else, that was off the mark, but nice effort. Question 5. Under Jim Crow laws, African Americans were A. Encouraged to run for public office. B. Segregated from whites in public places. C. Given equal access to education. D. Allowed to own land freely. Answer. B. Segregated from whites in public places. If you chose B, you're awesome because you nailed it. If you picked another option, that was a wonky choice, but keep it up. Question 6. Why were literacy tests given to African Americans under Jim Crow laws? A. To prevent them from voting. B. To improve education. C. To promote literacy. D. To encourage reading among all citizens. Answer. A. To prevent them from voting. If you picked A, you're super sharp because you got it right. If you guessed something else, that was a bit off, but keep going strong. Question 7. Sharecropping often resulted in A. Economic independence for African Americans. B. Debt and continued economic dependence for African Americans. C. Wealth for freedmen. D. Land ownership for African Americans. Answer. B. Debt and continued economic dependence for African Americans. If you picked B, you're killing it because that's correct. If you chose another answer, that was a bit off, but nice try. Question 8. What were African Americans prohibited from doing under the Black codes? A. Attending school. B. Working as farmers. C. owning firearms. D, practicing religion. Answer, C, owning firearms. If you pick C, you're on point because that's absolutely correct. If you chose something else, that was a bit wonky, but keep going. Question 9. Which of the following best describes the convict leasing system? A program that provided education to freedmen. B, a system that leased prisoners out for labor. C, a system where freedmen could lease land. D, a government initiative to provide jobs for African Americans. Answer, B, a system that leased prisoners out for labor. If you pick B, you're a rock star because you got it right. If you guessed something else, that was a bit off, but keep trying. Question 10. Apprenticeship laws were primarily used to A, provide vocational training. B, bind children of freedmen into labor contracts. C, offer scholarships for education. D, protect the rights of African American workers. Answer, B, bind children of freedmen into labor contracts. If you chose B, you're a genius because you nailed it. If you picked another option, that was a bit out there, but nice effort. Question 11. The pig laws were particularly harsh because they A, allowed for the creation of farms. B, criminalized minor offenses to re-enslave African Americans. C, encouraged fair labor practices. D, promoted animal welfare. Answer, B, criminalized minor offenses to re-enslave African Americans. If you chose B, you're amazing because that's correct. If you picked something else, that was a bit off, but keep going. Question 12. Why were African Americans barred from assembling in groups under the Black Codes? A, to encourage them to stay indoors. B, to promote community gatherings. C, to protect public health. D, to prevent them from organizing and resisting. Answer, D, to prevent them from organizing and resisting. If you chose D, you're on fire because you got it right. If you picked another option, that was off base, but keep it up. Question 13. What did apprenticeship laws allow former slave owners to do? A, set their slaves free. B, provide education for freedmen's children. C, rebuild their plantations. D, force the children of freedmen into labor. Answer, D, force the children of freedmen into labor. If you pick D, you're a history boss because that's right. If you guessed something else, that was off the mark, but nice try. Question 14. How did vagrancy laws affect African Americans after the Civil War? A, they granted land to freedmen. B, they allowed for the arrest and forced labor of African Americans. C, they provided education and housing. D, they ensured equal employment opportunities. Answer, B, they allowed for the arrest and forced labor of African Americans. If you pick B, you're super because you nailed it. If you chose something else, that was a wonky choice, but keep going. Question 15. Under Jim Crow laws, what happened if an African American violated segregation rules? A, they were fined and arrested. B, they were promoted in their jobs. C, they were given voting rights. D, they were protected by the law. Answer, A, they were fined and arrested. If you chose A, you're super sharp because you're correct. If you picked something else, that was a bit off, but keep trying. Question 16. What was the purpose of the Dred Scott decision? A, to grant citizenship to African Americans. B, to deny African Americans the rights of citizenship. C, to abolish slavery. D, to integrate schools. Answer, B, to deny African Americans the rights of citizenship. If you chose B, you're a rock star because you got it right. If you guessed another option, that was a bit wonky, but keep going. Question 17. Why was sharecropping a difficult system for African Americans? A, it guaranteed them wealth. B, it often led to debt and economic dependence. C, it provided them with free land. D, it was easy to break away from. Answer, B, it often led to debt and economic dependence. If you picked B, you're super smart because you nailed it. If you chose another answer, that was a bit off, but keep it up. Question 18. What was the impact of literacy tests on African Americans during the Jim Crow era? A, they improved literacy rates. B, they promoted educational equality. C, they were used to disenfranchise African Americans. D, they were required for all citizens. Answer, C, they were used to disenfranchise African Americans. If you chose C, you're killing it because that's correct. If you picked something else, That was off the mark, but keep trying. Question 19. What were African Americans prohibited from doing under the black codes? A. Serving as jurors. B. Owning large businesses. C. Practicing law. D. All of the above. Answer. D. All of the above. If you pick D, you're a legend because you got it right. If you guessed something else, that was a bit off, but keep going. Question 20. What was the convict leasing system designed to do? A. Provide education to African Americans. B. Enforce labor contracts on freedmen. C. Lease out prisoners for labor. D. Rebuild communities in the South. Answer. C. Lease out prisoners for labor. If you chose C, you're on fire because that's absolutely correct. If you picked another option, that was off base, but keep it up. Wrap up. Congrats on finishing the quiz. Whether you aced it or picked up some new knowledge, you're awesome for sticking through it. Keep that curiosity alive, and remember, you're all history champs in the making.